Blood, Bath & Beyond, The Wall Street Crime, by Michael Jones, M.D. We have been told for decades, it is not timing the market but time in the market, and set it and forget it. Most people have been working hard to build up our country and create a retirement for themselves. Meanwhile, other people have been extracting value out of the system at levels that you can only fathom as soon as you look under the hood. When I started to look under the hood, I had no idea how obvious the conflicts of interest were, and how the same mafia bust-out scheme had been perpetuated over and over at literally a global scale. As I started exposing this, I ended up getting a cease and desist from Virtu Financial CEO Doug Sifu. Part of that cease and desist was my allegations of possible connections between Doug Sifu and Jeffrey Epstein. This was over a year before the Epstein files came out. I was very cautious about what I said, and once the Epstein files came out, there were way more alleged connections than I could have imagined. What brought me into this was merely buying a stock, Bed Bath & Beyond, not for anything to do with how it was a meme stock or Ryan Cohen, but merely because the CEO Sue Gove came out in March 2023 and presented the turnaround plan, and it made sense to me. Then, before the capital raise that was needed for that turnaround plan was even over, it went into bankruptcy. That is when I started digging to figure out why, and I stumbled into the underbelly of the beast. I expected to find a business that failed. Businesses fail. What I found instead was a company that had been carried out of its own building piece by piece. The real estate sold off and leased back, the cash handed out in buybacks while the shelves went bare, the subsidiaries carved away one at a time, the lender pulling the trigger at the exact moment a trigger was needed, and a financing machine at the end that turned every new dollar into more shares until the shares were confetti. Every step of it was mostly public. So I kept pulling the thread, and the thread ran backward through everything. It ran through 4 banks assembled out of 14,000, through the 4 firms that signed the books for all of them, through a bank seized on its own birthday and sold overnight, through consultants whose fees were indexed to their own projections, through an island run by advisors whose own retirement fund held the debt they were restructuring. 4 years of full-time digging, and the same shape every time. The profits go somewhere private, the losses go into your retirement account, and the fine, when there finally is a fine, gets paid by the people who were robbed. And while I was finishing this book, the world started catching up. A federal jury convicted the most famous short seller of his generation for the exact scheme they told you was a conspiracy theory, publishing one thing and trading the other way in coordination with hedge funds. A major bank pleaded guilty to money laundering conspiracy, the first in American history. And Congress forced the Epstein files open by statute. The Justice Department put more than 3 million pages online, and the resignations started inside of 2 weeks, including the top lawyer at Goldman Sachs. Every one of those sentences has a docket number, a case name, or a government webpage behind it, and that is true of far more in these pages than you will want to believe. Pull them, search the files, read the orders. I spent 4 years, so you know where to look. I'd rather you check than take my word, because the whole point of what they built is that you were never supposed to look at all. This book is for the people who did everything right, who worked and saved and said it and forgot it exactly like they were told. It's time to look under the hood. Chapter 1, The Names on the Buildings Are Ghosts, How 14,000 Banks Became 4. The terrain before. In 1976, a 23-year-old college dropout named Jeffrey Epstein was hired at Bear Stearns. He had been teaching math and physics at the Dalton School on the Upper East Side, and he impressed the right parents, families connected to the firm's leadership. Bear Stearns took him on as a junior assistant on the trading floor. He made partner within 4 years and departed abruptly in 1981 to manage money on his own. Accounts of why he left differ, and Bear Stearns never fully explained it, but it had to do with fraud in oil futures, which is a theme that the global finance crime keeps coming back to. A mid-sized Wall Street partnership, small enough that a chairman personally noticed a schoolteacher, small enough that everyone knew everyone's clients. That was not an accident of culture. It was the deliberate architecture of American finance. After the crash of 1929, Congress built a financial system designed to stay fragmented. The McFadden Act of 1927 had already confined banks largely within state lines. The Douglas Amendment of 1956 barred holding companies from buying banks across them. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 split commercial banking from securities underwriting, so that the institution holding your deposits could not also gamble in the markets. The result, by the mid-1980s, was a country with more than 14,000 federally insured banks. A system in which no single institution could hold the economy hostage, because no single institution was large enough to matter that much. The next 25 years dismantled that architecture piece by piece. By the time the process was finished, 4 banks controlled nearly half the assets of the American banking system, and the fragmentation that had been the whole point of the post-war design was gone. The erosion began at the state level. Maine cracked the door open in 1978, permitting out-of-state bank holding companies to enter. Through the 1980s, states formed regional compacts allowing each other's banks across their borders, arrangements the Supreme Court blessed in 1985. The bank count started falling, through failures, through the savings and loan collapse, and above all through acquisitions. From its peak of more than 14,000 institutions in the mid-1980s, the industry shed roughly 6,000 banks by the end of the 1990s. Then Washington ratified what the states had begun. In September 1994, President Bill Clinton signed the Regal-Neal Interstate Banking and Branching Efficiency Act, which swept away the interstate restrictions entirely. As of June 1997, a bank holding company could branch across the whole country. The statute contained one safeguard worth noting. No single bank was to hold more than 10% of the nation's deposits through acquisition. Regal-Neal did more to concentrate American banking than any statute of the 20th century's second half. The merger wave it unleashed was immediate, and it built the 4 institutions that now dominate the country. The spring of 1998. The wave crested in a single astonishing season. In the spring and early summer of 1998, 4 of the largest mergers in the history of American finance were announced within 9 weeks of each other. On April 6, 1998, Travelers Group and Citicorp announced a roughly $70 billion merger, the largest corporate combination in history to that date. On April 13, Nations Bank announced it was taking over Bank America, and the same day, Bank One announced its merger with First Chicago NBD. On June 8, Norwest announced its merger with Wells Fargo. The Travelers-Citicorp deal deserves a longer look because it was illegal when it was signed. Travelers was an insurance and securities conglomerate. It owned Salomon Smith Barney. Citicorp was the largest commercial bank in the country. Under the Glass-Steagall regime and the Bank Holding Company Act, that combination was prohibited. Sandy Weil of Travelers and John Reed of Citicorp knew this. Before announcing, they placed courtesy calls to the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, the Secretary of the Treasury, and the President of the United States, not to ask permission exactly, but to inform them of what was coming. The Federal Reserve then approved the merger under a provision granting a 2-year grace period, extendable to 5, during which the combined company was supposed to divest whatever the law did not allow. Citigroup never intended to divest. The grace period was not a window for compliance, it was a countdown for Congress. Weil and the banking industry lobbied intensively for repeal of the Glass-Steagall barriers, and in November 1999, 19 months after the deal was announced, Congress delivered. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act passed the Senate 90-8 and the House 362-57, and President Clinton signed it on November 12, 1999. The law legalized, retroactively in effect, a merger that had already taken place. The deal came first. The law was rewritten to fit it. Coincidentally, the person who signed it, Bill Clinton, already had a very close relationship to Jeffrey Epstein, who helped him set up the Clinton Foundation. The revolving door, documented. No insinuation is required to complete the picture. The public record does it unassisted. Robert Rubin served as Clinton's Treasury Secretary from 1995 until July 1999, a period spanning Regal-Neal's implementation and the administration's support for financial modernization. On October 26, 1999, 17 days before the president signed Gramm-Leach-Bliley, Citigroup announced that Rubin was joining the company as a director and chairman of the executive committee. Over the following decade, Citigroup paid him well over $100 million. When Citigroup nearly collapsed in 2008, it received $45 billion in taxpayer capital and a federal guarantee on over $300 billion of its assets. None of this was hidden. None of it was, under the rules as written, illegal. That is precisely the point. The ghost names. Here is a detail that tells you who actually won the consolidation wars. Almost none of the winners kept their own names. The bank now called J.P. Morgan Chase is, corporately, Chemical Bank. Chemical absorbed Manufacturers Hanover in 1991 and kept its own name. In 1996, it acquired Chase Manhattan and took the Chase name because it was worth more. In 2000, Chase acquired the venerable J.P. Morgan & Co. and took that name too. The entity wearing the two most storied names in American banking is the acquirer that swallowed them both. The same pattern repeated everywhere. Nations Bank of Charlotte, originally NCNB, a regional bank from North Carolina, acquired Bank America in 1998 and renamed itself Bank of America. Norwest of Minneapolis acquired Wells Fargo in 1998 and took the Stagecoach brand for itself. The names on the buildings are ghosts. The famous banks lost. The aggressive acquirers won and dressed themselves in the losers' prestige. Through the 2000s, the survivors kept feeding. J.P. Morgan Chase took Bank One in 2004 for $58 billion, a deal whose real prize was Bank One's chief executive, Jamie Dimon. Bank of America took Fleet Boston in 2004, the credit card giant MBNA in 2006, LaSalle Bank in 2007. Wachovia, itself the product of a chain of mergers, bought the option arm lender Golden West in 2006, a purchase that would kill it within 2 years. The fire sale. The final round of consolidation was conducted at gunpoint, with the government holding the gun to its own head. In March 2008, Bear Stearns, the firm where Jeffrey Epstein had started 3 decades earlier, collapsed. The Federal Reserve brokered its emergency sale to J.P. Morgan Chase, initially at $2 a share, and absorbed roughly $29 billion of Bear's worst assets to make the deal happen. In September, the dominoes fell in sequence. Lehman Brothers failed on the 15th. The same weekend, Bank of America agreed to buy Merrill Lynch for roughly $50 billion. On September 21, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley converted to bank holding companies. And with that, the Independent American Investment Bank, the institution Glass-Steagall had created in 1933, ceased to exist. On September 25, regulators seized Washington Mutual, the largest bank failure in American history at over $300 billion in assets, and sold its banking operations to J.P. Morgan Chase overnight for $1.9 billion. A week later, Wells Fargo snatched the dying Wachovia away from a government-arranged sale to Citigroup. Nearly every one of these transactions was brokered, blessed, or backstopped by the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, or the Treasury. The emergency did not interrupt the concentration of American banking. It completed it. The numbers tell the story in one sentence. In 1990, the 5 largest banks held roughly a tenth of the industry's assets. By the early 2010s, they held close to half. J.P. Morgan Chase alone now sits on more than $4 trillion, an institution larger than the entire German economy's annual output, assembled from the bones of Chemical, Manufacturers Hanover, Chase, J.P. Morgan, Bank One, First Chicago, Bear Stearns, and Washington Mutual. With scale bought. So what did consolidation actually change? Not just size, accountability. In the world of 1976, the world of 14,000 banks, where Bear Stearns was a partnership and the partner's own money was on the line, a client relationship was visible to the whole firm. Everyone knew who the client was, what he did, and whose reputation was attached to him. In the world the mergers built, a bank became an archipelago of divisions with millions of customers, where compliance was a cost center, relationship revenue was a profit center, and a sufficiently powerful executive could stand between the two. Jeffrey Epstein became a client of J.P. Morgan Chase around 1998, the same year the merger wave crested. He remained one for 15 years. He remained one after his 2006 arrest in Palm Beach. He remained one after his 2008 guilty plea to state prostitution charges involving a minor, after his 13 months in custody, after he registered as a sex offender. Court filings from the United States Virgin Islands litigation later showed what the bank knew. Its own compliance staff flagged Epstein repeatedly over the years, noting the criminal case, the news coverage, and a pattern that should have ended the relationship on its own. Epstein withdrew hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, year after year. The flags went up, the relationship continued. The executive most identified with protecting it, Jess Staley, exchanged roughly 1,200 emails with Epstein, visited him, and rose to run J.P. Morgan's entire investment bank before leaving to become chief executive of Barclays. The bank finally exited the relationship in 2013. Epstein simply moved his accounts to Deutsche Bank, which kept him until 2018, 5 months before his final arrest. Nor was Epstein an aberration in Chase's client book. The same bank had spent more than 2 decades as Bernard Madoff's primary banker, and in 2014 paid $2.6 billion under a deferred prosecution agreement for failing to act on what its own people had seen. Twice in 1 decade, the largest bank in America settled with the government over what it had watched its most notorious clients do. The reckoning, when it came, was paid in the currency banks understand. In 2020, New York regulators fined Deutsche Bank $150 million for its handling of the Epstein relationship. In 2023, Deutsche Bank paid $75 million to settle claims by Epstein's victims. The same year, J.P. Morgan Chase paid $290 million to Epstein's victims and $75 million to the United States Virgin Islands, while insisting it regretted ever having him as a client. J.P. Morgan sued Staley personally to claw back his compensation, settling on undisclosed terms. British regulators banned Staley from the financial industry for misleading them about the relationship, a ban upheld on appeal in 2025. Notice what did not happen. No senior banker was indicted. No charter was threatened. For institutions of this size, $750 million in Epstein-related settlements was an operating expense. J.P. Morgan earns that back in a matter of days. That is what the consolidation of 1994 to 2008 actually purchased. Institutions too large for any client to embarrass, too profitable for any fine to deter, and too complex for any compliance officer to overrule the man who owns the relationship. Nobody had to order any of it. The structure did the work. J.P. Morgan closed Epstein's accounts in 2013. 15 years, 1 conviction, years of internal flags, and through all of it, an outside firm certified the bank's books annually, the way outside firms certify the books of every institution in this story. Virtu Financial was actually set up by J.P. Morgan to do their market making, and coincidentally, the Virtu Financial CEO Doug Sifu came from the law firm Paul Weiss, who was Epstein's personal lawyer. Removing Epstein's bank account at J.P. Morgan didn't distance them from Epstein very much, because market making was how they switched to moving money around anyway. The only people that would have known that this move by J.P. Morgan was merely a meaningless gesture were the auditors PwC. Chapter 2: Who audits the auditors? The sock drawer. In February 2005, a Texas businessman named Robert Simpson did something that was supposed to be impossible to do twice. He bought every share of a small public company called Global Links Corporation, all of them, roughly 1.16 million shares, 100% of the stock outstanding. He put the certificates away and waited. In the days that followed, tens of millions of shares of Global Links traded on the open market. One man owned the entire company. The float was 0. And yet the market went right on buying and selling shares of it, many multiples of every share that existed, as if nothing had happened. Whatever those buyers received in their brokerage accounts, it was not shares of Global Links Corporation, because a Texan had all of those in a drawer. Now ask the question, who would know? If the plumbing of the American market can manufacture and trade tens of millions of shares that do not exist, whose job is it to notice? The exchanges report trades, not truth. The brokers show you an account balance and assure you it's fine. The regulators rely on filings. And the filings, every balance sheet, every annual report, every set of books at every public company and every major bank in America, rest on one thing: the signature of an outside auditor swearing the numbers are fairly stated. The signatures are the thing to examine, and nearly all of them come from just 4 firms. 4 firms, one economy. They are called the Big Four: PwC, Deloitte, EY, and KPMG. Between them, they audit all but a handful of the S&P 500, measured by market value, effectively the entire investable American economy. Their combined global revenue exceeds $200 billion a year. Look at how the landscape is divided. PwC signs the books of Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, Virtu Financial, Citadel, Fidelity, Bank of America, Apex Clearing, and the DTCC, which does all stock settlement. KPMG signs the books of Citigroup and Wells Fargo, and, in a detail almost nobody knows, KPMG also audits the financial statements of the Federal Reserve banks themselves. Deloitte signs for Morgan Stanley. EY signs for Apple, Amazon, and Alphabet. 4 firms, standing between the public and the books of every institution that matters. Here is where it gets structurally interesting. Independence rules restrict how much consulting a firm can sell to its own audit client, the reform Congress passed after Enron. So what does a giant like Citigroup do for consulting, technology strategy, and advisory work? It hires the other 3. KPMG audits CD. That is exactly what frees PwC to work with CD everywhere else. And work with CD it does. CD and PwC have jointly published a shared framework for digital asset strategy. CD is partnered with PwC on tokenizing trade finance instruments, converting centuries-old paper like the bill of exchange into blockchain assets. And in 2024, Tim Ryan, the man who had run PwC's entire United States firm as senior partner since 2016, walked out of PwC and into Citigroup as head of technology and business enablement, reporting directly to the chief executive. The rules police a single bilateral line, the auditor and its client, and everything outside that line is open season. The result is that every systemically important institution in America is commercially entangled with all 4 firms at once, one as its auditor, the other 3 as its consultants, its strategists, its technology partners, and its supply of executives. There is no 5th phone number to call. Whoever picks up, it is one of the 4, and the 4 all work for each other's audit clients. Is that a conflict of interest? Formally, no, the lawyers will tell you each engagement is walled off. But ask it the way a normal person would. If the same 4 firms audit, advise, staff, and build the future infrastructure of the same few dozen giant institutions, decade after decade, whose interests does that ecosystem serve when something is wrong with the numbers? Charlie Munger's old rule applies. Show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome. The incentive: follow the money inside the firms themselves. Audit is not where the Big Four make their fortune. The majority of their revenue comes from consulting, advisory, and tax work. The audit is the credential, the consulting is the business. An audit franchise is what puts a firm inside every boardroom in the economy, and the consulting arms monetize the access. There is a legal definition of an audit, and the firms lean on it. An audit provides reasonable assurance that financial statements are free of material misstatement. It is not a guarantee against fraud, and it does not certify that a bank's clients are honest men. Auditors call the gap between what the public assumes and what the engagement letter says the expectations gap. Judge them on that narrow job. Did the numbers fairly represent reality? And look at the record. The body count. Start with the founding fraud of the modern era. Enron's auditor, Arthur Andersen, was one of the Big Five. Andersen was convicted of obstruction of justice in 2002 for shredding Enron documents, and the firm, 85,000 employees, disintegrated. The Supreme Court overturned the conviction 3 years later, but you cannot appeal a death sentence that has already been carried out. And here is the punchline history rarely tells. Andersen's thousands of corporate clients did not scatter to the winds. They were absorbed by the surviving 4 firms. The audit oligopoly America lives under today was consolidated by a fraud. The survivors' record since then, firm by firm. PwC audited Colonial Bank, which collapsed in 2009, atop one of the largest bank frauds in American history. A federal judge found PwC negligent. The court awarded the FDIC $625 million in damages, and PwC ultimately settled for $335 million, $1 of the largest auditor payouts ever recorded. EY audited Wirecard, the German payments giant, for a decade, right up until 2020, when it emerged that 1.9 billion euros of the company's cash simply did not exist. Germany's audit regulator barred EY from taking on new listed company audit clients for 2 years. And in 2022, in an entirely separate matter, EY paid $100 million to the SEC, the largest penalty ever imposed on an audit firm, because its own auditors had been caught cheating on the ethics portion of their professional exams, and the firm misled investigators about it. The people who certify America's books were cheating on their ethics tests. KPMG audited Carillion, the British construction giant whose 2018 collapse became a national scandal. UK regulators fined KPMG £21 million for audit failures they called exceptional, having already fined the firm separately after its personnel gave forged documents to inspectors reviewing that very audit. In America, KPMG gave Silicon Valley Bank a clean audit opinion on February 24, 2023. The bank failed 14 days later. KPMG had signed off on Signature Bank 11 days before it failed the same week. Deloitte's Malaysian firm paid $80 million to settle claims over its audits of 1MDB, the sovereign fund at the center of one of the largest looting scandals ever prosecuted. 4 for 4. Every firm entrusted with certifying reality has, in living memory, certified something that was not real, and in every case, the firm wrote a check, kept its license, and kept its clients. The stolen exam. After Enron, Congress finally built a watchdog for the watchdogs, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, created in 2002 to inspect the inspectors. Each year, the PCAOB selects a sample of a firm's audits and grades them. The one thing the system depends on is that the firms cannot know in advance which audits will be pulled. So consider what happened at KPMG. Between 2015 and 2017, KPMG hired staff directly out of the PCAOB, and those hires brought with them the regulator's confidential inspection plans, the actual lists of which KPMG audits were about to be examined. Senior partners used the stolen lists to go back and clean up the targeted files before the inspectors arrived. This was not a metaphor for regulatory capture. It was the watchdog's exam answers, physically stolen and put to use, and when it unraveled, it produced federal criminal convictions, including of the partner whose title, no less, was National Managing Partner for Audit Quality. KPMG paid a $50 million SEC penalty, which also covered a second embarrassment uncovered along the way: personnel sharing answers on internal training exams and manipulating the software to lower the passing score. The single institution created to audit the auditors was compromised by one of the auditors. If you wrote it as fiction, an editor would send it back as too on the nose. Who the guards answer to? The Big Four are networks of nationally owned partnerships. PwC's American firm is owned by its American partners, coordinated by global entities that own nothing. Though if you enjoy historical irony, the profession's American story really does begin with British capital. Price Waterhouse sent its men to New York in 1890 for one purpose: to keep watch over British investors' money in American ventures. Guarding absentee capital is the founding job description. The question is simply who the guards answer to now. The answer is an ecosystem of 4 firms that audit the entire economy, sell consulting to every institution they don't audit, staff the executive suites of their neighbors' audit clients, build the tokenized infrastructure the next financial era will run on, and answer to a regulator one of them has already been caught robbing. As with the bank mergers of the last chapter, nobody has to order anything. The structure does the work, and when the structure fails, the consequence is a fine the partnership absorbs as a cost of doing business. Remember Robert Simpson's sock drawer? Tens of millions of shares of a company he entirely owned traded without him. Somewhere in the chain, the broker, the market maker, the clearinghouse, the regulator, the books had to be wrong, and every set of books in that chain carried a clean opinion from one of 4 firms. Perhaps every engagement was walled off, every rule followed, every opinion defensible. The record above is why a reasonable citizen is entitled to doubt it. There is one more thing to examine before this story reaches its main years: what this structure does when a bank actually dies inside it. Who gets paid, who gets zeroed, who decides, and how fast. As it happens, the largest bank failure in American history offers a complete autopsy, performed overnight, on the patient's birthday. Chapter 3, Worth More Dead Than Alive. Seized on its birthday. Washington Mutual was founded in Seattle on September 25, 1889, 3 months after the Great Seattle Fire, to lend money to a city rebuilding from ashes. 119 years later, to the day, September 25, 2008, federal regulators walked in and pronounced it dead. The largest bank failure in American history occurred on the bank's own birthday. The mechanics took one evening. The Office of Thrift Supervision seized Washington Mutual Bank and handed it to the FDIC as receiver. The FDIC, in the same motion, sold the banking operations to J.P. Morgan Chase for $1.9 billion. By the regulator's own fact sheet, what changed hands that night was an institution with $307 billion in assets, 2,239 branches across 15 states, and 43,000 employees. The branches opened the next morning under new ownership, as if nothing had happened. Even the timing was strange. Bank seizures happen on Fridays. It is practically a law of nature, giving regulators a weekend to sort out the mess before markets open. WAMU was taken on a Thursday. The official explanation was fear of leaks. The process was moving so fast, with so many parties involved, that the government could not trust its own secret to survive one more day. Everyone attached to WAMU's life was destroyed that night. Everyone positioned for its death did fine. What follows is an autopsy, not an accusation of any crime, but an accounting. When a bank is worth more dead than alive, it is worth asking, precisely and in dollars, to whom? The ledger of the living. Start with what death cost the people who had bet on WAMU surviving. The shareholders lost everything. At its peak, WAMU's equity was worth roughly $40 billion. All of it went to zero, including $7.2 billion in fresh capital that had been raised just 5 months earlier, in April 2008, in a rescue led by the private equity firm TPG. The TPG investment deserves its own paragraph because it is the strangest fact in the story. TPG was not a tourist. Its founder, David Bonderman, had sat on WAMU's own board of directors for years in the 1990s. He knew the company from the inside. TPG did its diligence, invested roughly $1.35 billion of its own money at $8.75 a share, and brought co-investors to a $7.2 billion total. In September, as conditions worsened, TPG even waived its anti-dilution protections to clear the way for a rescue or sale. None came. 5 months after writing the check, one of the most sophisticated investors in America was wiped out to the last dollar. Hold the question this raises, because there is no comfortable answer. Either TPG's diligence failed completely, or the institution it inspected in April did not need to die in September. One of those must be true. The holding company's bondholders were cut off from the bank's assets overnight and spent the next 4 years in bankruptcy court fighting over the remains. And notably, WAMU got none of the mercy being handed out that same month. It was seized 8 days before the TARP bailout was signed into law. Its debt holders received no government protection of the kind extended that very week to the creditors of nearly identical institutions. The ledger of the dead. Now the other side, who was positioned to profit from the corpse? The short sellers first, because this is where legend outruns arithmetic, and the arithmetic is worth doing in public. The short interest in WAMU was enormous and well documented. In August 2008, a small investor wrote an open letter to the SEC, preserved in the agency's public comment files, pointing out that short interest in WAMU had reached 341 million shares, more than 32% of the stock outstanding, and pleading with the commission to add WAMU to its protected list. He was right about the number. But note when it occurred. By July 2008, when the short interest hit that level, WAMU traded near $4. A short position of 341 million shares, riding from $4 to zero, yields about $1.4 billion. Even under fantasy assumptions, every shorted share sold at the all-time high. The stock's entire peak value was only $40 billion. You cannot harvest from an equity more than the equity ever contained. Shorting WAMU's stock produced profits in the hundreds of millions to low billions, spread across many hands. Add the credit default swaps. When the auction to settle WAMU CDS was held that October, the contracts paid out about 43 cents on the dollar of protection bought, real money, but again measured in billions at most, and the buyers of that protection included ordinary bondholders hedging, not just speculators. So the shorts were scavengers. They fed on the body, they did not inherit the estate. The estate went to the buyer. For $1.9 billion, J.P. Morgan Chase received the third-largest branch network in America, $188 billion in deposits, and the entire West Coast retail footprint it had coveted for a decade, the missing piece that made it a truly national bank. It also assumed the liabilities and the poisoned loan book, and then watch how J.P. Morgan handled the poison. It immediately marked the acquired loans down by roughly $30 billion, a colossal cushion. And in the years that followed, as the loans performed better than the marks, the difference flowed quietly back into J.P. Morgan's earnings. The bank got the franchise for 2 days' profit, insulated itself with the write-down, and then recovered part of the write-down too. Jamie Dimon has never pretended otherwise. By any commercial measure, it was one of the great acquisitions in banking history. And the FDIC, the resolution cost the Deposit Insurance Fund nothing, zero. WAMU remains the only mega-failure of the crisis that did not cost the fund a dime, because every dollar of loss was assigned to WAMU's own investors instead. From the government's ledger, this was the perfect death. The depositors saved, the fund untouched, the problem transferred to a strong bank by breakfast. The people who supplied that perfection were WAMU's shareholders and creditors, who were never asked. The buyer who had been waiting. None of this was a spontaneous rescue. J.P. Morgan had wanted Washington Mutual for years, and the record of its patience is public. In the spring of 2008, J.P. Morgan approached WAMU directly, floating an offer of roughly $8 a share. WAMU's board said no and took TPG's money instead. J.P. Morgan did not go away. Inside the bank, the pursuit of WAMU carried a codename, Project West, and the planning continued through the summer while WAMU bled. When the FDIC quietly solicited bids in the final week, J.P. Morgan was, unsurprisingly, ready. It won the auction the day the bank died and told its own investors the deal would add to earnings immediately. What happened between the rejected offer in spring and the $1.9 billion purchase in fall became the subject of years of litigation. Washington Mutual's holding company, and separately a group of its investors, sued J.P. Morgan. They alleged, in federal court filings, under penalty of sanction, that J.P. Morgan had used sham negotiations to extract confidential information from WAMU and had worked to depress confidence in the bank so that it could acquire the assets cheaply out of receivership. In plain words, that WAMU was worth more to J.P. Morgan dead than alive, and that J.P. Morgan knew it. J.P. Morgan denied all of it. The investor suit was ultimately dismissed on jurisdictional grounds, without any court ruling on whether it was true. The holding company's claims were folded into a global settlement in 2012 that distributed roughly $7 billion from the wreckage. No wrongdoing was ever established. The idea that WAMU was worth more dead than alive was not invented after the fact. It was pleaded by WAMU's own estate. Whose losses count? Now the asymmetry, which is where the story stops being about one bank and becomes about the system. 4 days after WAMU died with its creditors unprotected, an almost identical institution reached the same cliff. Wachovia, another coast-to-coast lender destroyed by the same option arm mortgages via its Golden West acquisition, was failing the weekend of September 27-28. This time, the government's answer was different. On September 29, the FDIC invoked, for the first time in its history, the systemic risk exception, blessing a rescue structure in which Wachovia's creditors would be protected. Days later, Wells Fargo swept in with a higher bid and bought Wachovia whole, wiping out no one. WAMU's bondholders got receivership, Wachovia's got par. The two decisions were made by the same officials in the same week about the same disease. No official has ever fully explained why one set of losses counted and the other did not. And there is one more document from that week, obscure and astonishing. On September 30, 2008, 5 days after WAMU's seizure, the day after Wachovia's rescue was arranged, the Treasury Department issued Notice 2008-83, a 2-page ruling that quietly suspended a decades-old tax rule so that a bank acquiring another bank could use the target's built-in loan losses to shelter its own future profits. Translated, the corpse's wounds became a tax asset for whoever ate it. Analysts valued the change to Wells Fargo alone in the billions. Congress was so disturbed that in early 2009, it repealed the notice and wrote into law that Treasury's authority to issue it is doubtful, and then grandfathered every deal already done in reliance on it. The government's own legislature concluded the ruling should never have existed, and everyone kept the money. If you want a single artifact proving that, in the autumn of 2008, official policy made dead banks more valuable than living ones. It is Notice 2008-83. One more timing note for the file. On September 18-19, the SEC banned short selling in hundreds of financial stocks, WAMU included, 6 days before the seizure. Whatever the shorts had done to WAMU, they were locked out of the room when it died. The final blow was administered by no one who needed to borrow a share. The rot was real. Washington Mutual was not an innocent murdered in its sleep. The Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations later made WAMU its lead case study of the mortgage machine, and the findings are sickening on their own terms. Internal investigations in 2005 found fraud in the majority of loans sampled at certain high-volume offices. At one, 58% of the files. At another, 83%, and the loans kept flowing, and loans from those very channels were packaged and sold to investors anyway. WAMU manufactured a meaningful share of the poison that ended up killing it, and its executives were paid richly for the volume. By September 2008, the bank had suffered a genuine run, $16.7 billion out the door in 9 days after Lehman fell, and by its regulators' account, it could no longer be sure of meeting its obligations, even though its capital ratios still technically cleared the well-capitalized bar. Its own CEO, testifying later, insisted the bank should have been given the chance the others got. Maybe. Its own lending record argues it had forfeited sympathy. Both things are true at once. WAMU was guilty of poisoning itself and its borrowers, and, separately, the manner of its death was the most profitable event in the story for everyone except the people who owned it, the shareholders. The shorts collected their millions. The buyer collected a national franchise for $1.9 billion, cushioned by a $30 billion markdown it partially recovered. The insurance fund collected a perfect zero. The Treasury issued a tax ruling that turned bank corpses into assets, and Congress called it improper while honoring every claim. The only parties who paid for Washington Mutual's death were the ones who had paid for its life. In the American financial system of September 2008, the incentives around a dying bank ran toward the grave. "Show me the incentive," Munger said, "and I will show you the outcome." Washington Mutual's death was quick. A receivership performed in a single evening. Most corporate deaths are slower, and slow deaths have attendants, advisors who bill at the bedside, under fee structures that pay whether or not the patient lives. Chapter 4: The Wire Never Died. When the BNP Paribas plea was announced in June 2014, the Department of Justice presented it as the end of an era. The largest sanctions penalty in history, proof that the era of banks moving forbidden money through the American financial system was over. But the rest of the docket tells a different story. The wire never died. It just kept paying tolls. Run the tape backward first. In 2010, Wachovia, the same Wachovia whose creditors were rescued entered a deferred prosecution agreement admitting it had failed to monitor roughly $378 billion that flowed through Mexican currency exchange houses, channels the government tied to drug cartels. The penalty was $160 million, about 0.04% of the flow. No banker was charged. In 2012, HSBC admitted in its own deferred prosecution agreement that it had laundered money for the Sinaloa cartel, among others. The penalty was $1.9 billion, roughly 5 weeks of profit, and the Attorney General's deputies conceded to Congress, in substance, that the bank was too big to prosecute. The phrase, too big to jail, entered the language from this case. Standard Chartered was caught doing exactly what BNP did, stripping identifying data from Iranian wires, and was penalized in 2012, and then again in 2019, for continuing. Now run it forward from BNP. In 2017, Deutsche Bank paid roughly $630 million over mirror trades that moved $10 billion out of Russia through paired stock transactions with no economic purpose except relocation of money. In 2020, a Goldman Sachs subsidiary pleaded guilty in the 1MDB affair, the looting of a Malaysian sovereign fund, with U.S. penalties above $2.9 billion and a partner, Tim Lessner, pleading guilty personally. In 2022, Danske Bank pleaded guilty in the United States and paid $2 billion after roughly 200 billion euros in suspicious money moved through a single Estonian branch. And in 2020, the FinCEN files, thousands of the bank's own leaked suspicious activity reports, showed the industry moving some $2 trillion in transactions its own compliance staff had flagged, filing the paperwork and moving the money anyway. Then came the case that retired the idea that any of this was history. In October 2024, TD Bank became the first bank in American history to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering. Not a books and records charge, not a monitoring failure, the actual conspiracy. The record showed trafficking networks, including fentanyl operations, moving hundreds of millions through the bank while employees took bribes in gift cards to keep the windows open. The penalties totaled $3.09 billion, and regulators imposed something rarer than any fine, an asset cap, the punishment previously reserved for Wells Fargo's fake account scandal. Even then, the charter survived. The bank opened the next morning. Line the cases up, and the pattern is not subtle. Cartel money, sanctioned money, kleptocrat money, and trafficking money moved through the largest banks in the world across 2 decades, before BNP and after it. Each discovery produced a settlement priced below the profits of the era that produced it. Almost none produced a prosecution of the people who ran the institutions. None revoked a charter. The Justice Department's press releases call each case historic. The sequence of them is the history. A toll system, publicly administered, in which the cost of moving forbidden money through the front door of the American banking system has been discovered, paid, and budgeted, again and again, by institutions that remain in business today. So whenever the story turns to capital that needed to move without being seen, this record stands behind it. The state's own dockets establish that the front door was open the entire time, and that the people who owned the door treated getting caught as a line item. Chapter 5, Mechanisms of the Kill, the Fee is the Weapon. The Attendants at the Bedside. Washington Mutual died in one evening. Most corporate deaths are slower. Years of decline, restructurings, transformations, turnarounds, and slow deaths have attendants. They arrive in teams, bill by the engagement, and are gone before the funeral. The management consultants are the attendants worth watching because the fee structures themselves are pointed at the kill target. 2 case studies, one small and one the size of an island, show the mechanism working in the open. The consultant's optimism, priced. In 2019, GameStop was dying by every conventional measure. Its own consultants would later describe it in a federal court, filing as on life support, bleeding customers, with net operating losses near $800 million the year before, and a stock that had fallen from around $55 to $3.32. The management of that era did what dying American companies do. It hired the Boston Consulting Group to run a transformation. Look closely at how BCG was to be paid, because the arrangement laid out in BCG's own lawsuit is the purest artifact of the whole pattern. The fees were pegged not to profits GameStop actually earned, but to projections. In the contract's language, the best possible estimate of each initiative's expected impact, fixed at the moment each initiative was launched, not results. Estimates of results made at the start by the parties being paid. The consultant's compensation was indexed to the consultant's own optimism, and the sicker the patient, the more room there was to project improvement. Whatever happened to GameStop afterward, the fees were owed. What happened afterward was Ryan Cohen. The Chewy founder took a large stake in 2020, joined the board in January 2021, became chairman that June, and swept out the old regime. The new GameStop looked at roughly $30 million in outstanding BCG fees for the old regime's transformation, and did something almost no client of a major consultancy has ever done. It refused, publicly, on the stated ground that paying consultants who had not generated results was not in shareholders' interest. Cohen mocked the whole class of advisors in the press. Of another dying retailer's consultant-built plan, he remarked that the strategy looks far better in a PowerPoint deck than it does in practice. So in March 2022, BCG sued its own former patient in federal court in Delaware, demanding the $30 million and thereby placing on the public record the description of GameStop quoted above. A firm explaining under oath, in effect, that the client had been nearly dead when the fees were incurred, and that the fees were due regardless of whether the treatment worked, because the contract said the fees were never about whether the treatment worked. The suit ground on for 2 years and 4 months. In late July 2024, the parties filed a joint stipulation of dismissal, the signature of a quiet, negotiated settlement, and the terms have never been disclosed. Neither side has claimed victory. Now understand what the live lawsuit meant in practice, because it is easy to miss and it sits in BCG's own filing. The engagement did not end when the consultants went home. The contract obligated GameStop to keep holding meetings with BCG to confirm the profit improvement figures on which the fees were calculated. A recurring, contractual window into the company's financial internals. And BCG sued in part because the new regime slammed that window shut, refusing the meetings and refusing to furnish the data. Litigation pried it back open. A live fee case whose damages turned on GameStop's profits gave BCG's lawyers discovery into exactly the numbers a company plotting in secret least wants examined. And consider what GameStop was quietly becoming while the case was pending. A company whose board handed one-man authority over its investment portfolio. A company that raised billions in fresh cash in the spring of 2024 with the suit still alive. Any major transaction attempted in those years would have generated the things transactions generate: disclosures, diligence files, projections, all of it feeding a channel that ran through a courtroom to the consultant's counsel. No injunction is needed to make that intolerable for a company whose next act depended on nobody seeing its cards. The periscope is enough. Whether closing it shaped the timing, only the principals know. What the record shows is the sequence, and the sequence speaks. In late July 2024, GameStop paid whatever it paid, the terms have never been disclosed, and the periscope came down. Through 2025, the company added billions more in zero-coupon convertible notes and moved part of the pile into Bitcoin, until the cash approached $9 billion. A war chest bolted to a company that consultants had pronounced terminal at $3.32 a share. In January 2026, Cohen began hinting at a transformational acquisition. And in May 2026, GameStop did the most consultant-proof thing imaginable. It bid roughly $56 billion, $125 a share, half cash, half stock, with a $20 billion financing letter from TD, for eBay, a company 4 times its size. Cohen was plain about the ambition. E-commerce is his wheelhouse, and in his view, no asset has more potential than eBay. eBay's board rejected the offer as neither credible nor attractive. Cohen responded by scrapping a pay package worth up to $35 billion, saying he wanted leadership focused on the pursuit. The island. Now scale the mechanism up from a retailer to 3 million people. In 2016, Congress passed PROMESA, placing Puerto Rico, a United States territory whose citizens have no voting representation in the Congress that did this, under an unelected financial oversight and management board with power over the island's budget, superior to its elected government. Puerto Ricans call it La Junta. Its assignment was the largest public debt restructuring in American history, more than $70 billion in bonds, plus a pension system tens of billions short. The board's lead strategic consultant, from the beginning, was McKinsey & Company. Over the years of the restructuring, McKinsey's fees ran well past $100 million, one stream within a broader torrent, because the professionals in Puerto Rico's bankruptcy, taken together, billed over $1 billion from a bankrupt territory. The advisors' invoices were paid in full and on time throughout a process whose purpose was deciding how much less everyone else would be paid. Then, in 2018 and 2019, the New York Times reported the pivotal fact. McKinsey operates an in-house investment office called MIO Partners, a multi-billion-dollar fund managing the money of McKinsey's own current and former partners. While McKinsey advised the board on restructuring Puerto Rico's bonds, MIO held Puerto Rico bonds through outside funds it had placed money with. Follow the geometry. The board McKinsey advised would decide how many cents on the dollar the island's creditors received. The island's creditors included, indirectly, the retirement money of McKinsey's own partners. The firm advising the executioner had money riding on the estate, and it was long, not short. Every dollar of austerity that improved debt service capacity flowed toward the recoveries of bondholders, among them the advisor's own fund. In a slight variation of the mafia bust-out, nobody needed to distort anything downward. The conflict pointed the other way, toward squeezing the living to pay the paper they bought up cheaply as junk bonds. And the squeezing was not theoretical. Under the fiscal plans of the oversight era, Puerto Rico closed hundreds of public schools, slashed the University of Puerto Rico's budget, and spent years proposing pension cuts that were beaten back only by sustained protest before the final plan largely spared retirees. The debt plan confirmed in 2022 did genuinely shrink the island's obligations. The defense deserves its sentence. But the distribution of the pain was designed by a process whose most important advisor had an undisclosed financial stake in the outcome. What happened when the conflict surfaced completes the picture. McKinsey denied that its advice was influenced. The oversight board hired an outside law firm to review the matter, and the review found no evidence the advice had been shaped by MIO's holdings. A conclusion the reader may weigh alongside the fact that the board being reassured was the same board paying the fees. The SEC later fined MIO Partners $18 million over failures in its controls against trading on non-public information drawn from McKinsey's consulting work. And Congress did something remarkable, which is the receipt that makes this section bulletproof. In 2022, it passed a statute, PRRADA, the Puerto Rico Recovery Accuracy and Disclosures Act, specifically forcing professionals in Puerto Rico's cases to disclose their conflicts of interest, a law that exists because the disclosures had not. When the legislature has to write a new act of Congress to find out whether the territory's advisors are betting on the territory's debt, the mechanism has been named by the government itself. A profession with no license to lose. Why do the incentives keep pointing this way? Because consulting is the only actor in this story with no regulator at all. Recall the architecture. Banks answer to the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the OCC. Their charters can, in principle, be revoked. Auditors answer to the PCAOB, a watchdog that has at least once been robbed but exists. Consultants answer to no one. There is no license to practice strategy and therefore none to lose, no inspection regime, no capital requirement, no duty to any party but the client who signs the engagement letter, and sometimes, as Puerto Rico showed, not obviously even that. The consequences, when they come, arrive as settlements priced comfortably below the fees. The pattern holds across the record. McKinsey advised Purdue Pharma on accelerating OxyContin sales during a drug epidemic. It paid $573 million to the states in 2021 and roughly $650 million more to the Justice Department in 2024 under a deferred prosecution agreement. and a senior partner agreed to plead guilty to obstruction for destroying records, one of the only times in the profession's history that a consultant faced a criminal consequence for consulting. The same firm paid $15 million to settle Justice Department claims that it had failed to disclose its conflicts in bankruptcy cases, the same species of omission as Puerto Rico, in the same courts. In South Africa, McKinsey apologized and returned tens of millions in fees from contracts entangled in the state capture scandal. Each time, a payment, an apology where unavoidable, and the next engagement. The firms are not fined out of the market for the same reason they are not regulated into it. They have persuaded the world that advice is weightless, even as the invoices prove otherwise. Fees index to projections, so the advisor is paid for optimism rather than outcomes. Fees that survive the client, so the death of the patient does not interrupt the billing. Advisors whose own funds hold the outcome, so the advice arrives pre-invested. And a profession with nothing to revoke, so the worst case is a check. Show me the incentive, you know the rest. But the consultant story leaves a thread hanging. Fines and settlements keep surfacing, 9 figures here, 10 there, as though punishment were finally arriving. Follow any of those checks to the account it is actually drawn on, and the people who earned the penalty are not there. Who really pays when a corporation is punished, and who was paid before the bill ever arrived, comes next. Chapter 6, Convicted, the Short and Distort File. For years, the phrase short and distort was treated by the financial press as retail folklore, the coping myth of people who lost money. The phrase now has a conviction, a docket number, and a sentencing date. What follows is the adjudicated floor, not the full map, but the terrain the government itself has now proven exists. Begin with the conviction. On June 1, 2026, a federal jury in Los Angeles found Andrew Left, founder of Citron Research, the most famous activist short seller of his generation, a fixture of financial television, guilty on 13 of 17 counts of securities fraud. The proven scheme was the mechanism long dismissed as baseless conspiracy. Left published market-moving recommendations to the public and then privately traded in the opposite direction, harvesting more than $20 million between 2018 and 2023. The trial record went further. Prosecutors showed he concealed compensation arrangements and coordinated with hedge funds that positioned themselves in tandem with Citron's publications, the report and fund pipeline, in evidence beyond reasonable doubt. It is the first criminal conviction of an activist short seller in American history. He faces up to 25 years on the lead count. Sentencing is set for August 31, 2026, and an appeal is promised. The SEC's parallel fraud suit describes at least 26 episodes across 23 companies. And the scheme had staff. A Beverly Hills associate, Ryan Choi, paid $1.8 million to settle SEC charges over his role in 2 Citron tweets alone. Left was not an isolated organism. In June 2024, Anson Funds paid $2.25 million to settle SEC charges over undisclosed involvement with publishers of bearish research, the fund paying the publisher, unseen by the readers who traded on the reports. And beginning in 2021, the Justice Department ran a sweeping grand jury investigation into roughly 30 short-selling firms and researchers, the dragnet from which the Left prosecution emerged. The ecosystem was investigated as an ecosystem. Now the plumbing. In August 2023, the SEC sanctioned Citadel Securities, the largest retail market maker in America, for marking millions of short sale orders as long over a 5-year period. At the center of the market, for years, short sales were recorded as the opposite of what they were. The same firm had previously paid $22.6 million over misleading order handling disclosures. Virtu Financial, the other giant of retail market making, was charged by the SEC in 2023 over information barriers that allegedly let broad groups of employees access customer order information. And the dark venues where institutions meet in private were sanctioned for rigging the room. Barclays and Credit Suisse paid $154 million combined for lying to clients about predatory high-frequency traders inside their pools. ITG paid $20.3 million for running a secret proprietary desk that traded against its own pool's customers. UBS and Deutsche Bank paid for their own pool misrepresentations. Every one of those sentences is an enforcement order, not an inference. Then January 2021 itself, through the government's own microscope. The House Financial Services Committee's investigative report established what happened at the clearing choke point on the morning of January 28. The clearinghouse's initial deposit call on Robinhood was roughly $3.7 billion. A $2.2 billion excess capital premium charge was then waived, dropping the demand to about $1.4 billion, and the buy button was switched off anyway, across the platforms where the buyers lived. Robinhood separately paid the largest fine in FINRA's history, $70 million and $65 million to the SEC over payment for order flow disclosures. The SEC's own staff report on the episode recorded short interest in GameStop at roughly 123% of the available float. Private data vendors measured above 140, an official acknowledgement that the stock had been sold more times than it existed. The same phenomenon sits in public FINRA data for the retail ETF XRT, whose reported short interest has repeatedly run to multiples of its shares outstanding. Finally, the blindness confessed. In March 2021, a single-family office, Archegos, detonated with roughly $160 billion in gross exposure built entirely of swaps that no reporting regime captured. Its founder was convicted and sentenced to 18 years. 2 years later, the SEC adopted Rule 13F2, requiring large short positions to be reported for the first time in the agency's 90-year existence, a rule whose first filings arrived only in 2026. The regulator's own rulemaking is the admission. Until this year, nobody, including the government, could see the whole short book. That is the floor. Manipulation by a celebrated short seller, convicted, fund-to-publisher payments, sanctioned, short sales misreported at the largest market maker, sanctioned, dark venues rigged by their operators, sanctioned, the clearing system exercising billion-dollar discretion on the decisive morning, documented by Congress, short interest above 100%, documented by the SEC. Total opacity of short positioning until 2026, conceded by the SEC's own rulebook. How far above that floor the structure rises is open to argument. The floor itself is no longer in dispute. Chapter 7: Privatizing the Profits, Socializing the Risks. Skin in the Game and its Absence. Economists gave the disease a name half a century ago. In 1976, Michael Jensen and William Meckling published the most cited paper in the history of corporate finance, describing what happens when the people who run a company are not the people who own it. The agent's incentives quietly detach from the owners, and the gap fills with everything cataloged so far. The modern executive compensation package did not close that gap. It industrialized it. Stock options pay for upside and cost nothing on the downside. Severance agreements pay for failure. Bonus targets pay for the projection of results, the same mechanism found in a consulting contract. A hired executive holding options and a parachute participates in the profits and is insulated from the risks by design. The phrase for this is older than the paper: privatize the gains, socialize the losses. It runs through 3 levels: the paycheck, the penalty, and the exit. Start with the counterexamples because they prove the rule. William Pult, who founded Pult Homes in 1950, kept a massive personal shareholding in the company his whole life and used it. In his 80s, unhappy with the hired management of his life's work, he leveraged his stake in a public campaign that ended with the chief executive announcing his departure. An owner can do that. Ryan Cohen bought tens of millions of GameStop shares with his own money, and as chief executive takes no salary at all. His entire compensation is the fate of the stock every other shareholder holds. Whatever one thinks of either man's judgment, their incentive is not in question. They eat their own cooking. The concern here is the executives who don't, and who ends up eating it for them. The fine that punishes the victims. Here is the mechanism at the second level, and once seen it cannot be unseen. When a corporation is punished for its conduct, the punishment is paid by the corporation. which is to say, by its current shareholders, employees, and creditors, most of whom had nothing to do with the conduct, and many of whom weren't even there when it happened. The individuals who made the decisions have, by the time the fine arrives, already been paid. Salaries don't get clawed back, exercised options don't get refunded. The penalty lands on the shell, and the shell is owned by the public. Scholars who study deferred prosecution agreements have documented the pattern for years. In most corporate criminal resolutions, no individual is charged at all. The company confesses, the people walk. The opioid catastrophe supplies the two definitive specimens. The pharmacy first. Rite Aid spent the epidemic doing what the government later alleged in a federal complaint: filling prescriptions it had every reason to know were unlawful, ignoring its own pharmacists' warnings while the volume flowed. Through those years, its executives were paid tens of millions in ordinary course. Then the bill arrived. Facing the Justice Department's suit and billions in debt, Rite Aid filed for bankruptcy in October 2023, settled the government's opioid claims for a nine-figure sum it could not actually pay, emerged briefly as a creditor-owned shell, and filed again in May 2025, this time to die. By the end of 2025, after 63 years, there were no Rite Aids left. The stores closed or sold, tens of thousands of jobs gone, the shareholders wiped to zero, the pensioned and the passive alike holding the loss. And the individual accountability for the opioid conduct? None. It is not that Rite Aid executives are unprosecutable. A generation earlier, Chief Executive Martin Grass went to federal prison for 8 years for accounting fraud. The system demonstrated exactly once that it could reach a Rite Aid executive and never use the reach again. Now the manufacturer, the purest expression of privatized profit and socialized risk that American law has ever produced. Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to federal crimes over OxyContin's marketing in 2007. 3 of its executives pleaded to misdemeanors and served not a day. And then the owners began taking the money out. In the decade after that first guilty plea, the Sackler family withdrew roughly $11 billion from the company, moving the profits of the conduct out of the entity that would eventually answer for the conduct. When 3,000 lawsuits finally converged, what was left to sue was the husk. Purdue filed for bankruptcy in 2019, and the family offered to return a portion of what it had removed in exchange for permanent immunity from every present and future claim. It nearly worked. It took the Supreme Court of the United States, in 2024, to rule that a bankruptcy court cannot sell strangers legal claims against people who are not bankrupt. The rebuilt settlement was confirmed in late 2025 and became effective on the 1st of May, 2026. The Sacklers pay up to roughly $7 billion over 15 years, are permanently barred from selling opioids in America, and admit nothing. Purdue itself dissolved into a successor company run by strangers, its remaining profits directed to abatement. Do the arithmetic the settlement itself invites. Roughly $11 billion out. About $6.5 billion back on an installment plan. No admission, no indictment, no day in prison for anyone who owned or ran the company through the deadliest drug marketing campaign in history. The profits were privatized in the most literal sense available, carried out of the building, and the risk was socialized onto a bankruptcy estate, a victims fund, and the public health system of every state in the Union. Were they short? A suspicion naturally follows. If the friends of people inside these companies knew what was coming, were they also positioned to profit from the fall and short the stock as the liabilities ripened? Short positions often don't have to be reported, and so it is hard for anyone but the regulators to see. What is clear is that someone was short, and someone knew. We can see this clearly in executives who sell before very bad news. Enron's executives and directors sold roughly $1 billion of their own stock in the 2 years before the collapse, many of them while publicly urging employees and investors to buy. A generation of executives then discovered Rule 10b-5-1, automatic trading plans meant as a safe harbor, and abused the timing so systematically that academics measured the abnormal profits. The SEC was forced to rewrite the rule in 2022 with cooling-off periods and certifications, and in 2024, a chairman named Taryn Peaser became the first person criminally convicted for it. sentenced to 3.5 years for dumping $20 million of stock through hastily adopted plans while sitting on undisclosed bad news. Selling ahead of the fall is not a theory. It has case numbers. The other half of the suspicion, that the visible short interest is only the surface, with the real positioning hidden offshore or inside derivatives, has its own receipts. In March 2021, a single-family office named Archegos detonated with roughly $160 billion in gross exposure that had been invisible to the market and to most of its own lenders, because it was built entirely of total return swaps that nobody had to report. The positions were long, but the lesson is directional agnostic. The reporting system could not see an elephant. 2 years later, the SEC adopted an entirely new rule, 13F2, requiring large short positions to be reported at all, an official confession that the agency policing the market could not previously see short exposure. After delays, the first filings arrived only in 2026. And GameStop itself supplied the era's most famous number. By the SEC's own staff report on the 2021 events, short interest peaked at roughly 123% of the available float. Private data vendors measured over 140, a figure above 100%, which is possible when lent shares are sold, repurchased, and lent again down a chain, and which at minimum means the same shares were sold more times than they existed. That same report also found the January price explosion was driven mostly by buying rather than short covering, a finding that stands alongside the rest rather than against it. A market in which positions worth more than the float can exist, in which 9-figure swap books are invisible, and in which the regulator has to invent a reporting rule 90 years into its existence, is a market in which the public's knowledge of who is positioned for a company's death is, by the regulator's own admission, incomplete. Exit liquidity, the machine that buys at the top. The third level is the exit, and it requires understanding one mechanical fact about the modern retirement system. A capitalization-weighted index fund buys more of a stock the more expensive it becomes. That is not a flaw in the product. It is the definition of the product. Your 401(k) automatically owns the most of whatever is most inflated at the moment of maximum inflation. Economists Xavier Gabaix and Ralph Koijen have formalized what this implies. That flows into inelastic, price-insensitive vehicles move prices and stand ready to absorb whatever is sold to them. In plain words, the indexed retirement saver is the standing bid. Whoever needs to sell at the top, sells to him. Now watch the mechanism operate at the largest scale ever recorded. By early 2000, technology had swollen to roughly a third of the S&P 500, which meant a third of every indexed retirement dollar in America. America Online, a dial-up internet service whose business model was already visibly mortal, carried a market value above $200 billion. On January 10, 2000, 9 weeks before the Nasdaq's all-time peak, AOL announced it would use that paper to buy Time Warner. The magazines, the studios, the cable systems, HBO, a century of whatever was written down by the Hollywood mob as assets, in an all-stock deal in which AOL's shareholders, the holders of the inflated asset, received 55% of the combined company. Time Warner was a toxic asset, and so was AOL, but AOL still had the index funds buying it up mechanically. The bubble stock was the currency, and the deal converted it, at the exact top, into permanent claims on hard assets, while AOL and Time Warner's insiders separately converted their personal paper into cash, selling hundreds of millions of dollars of stock around the merger. Chairman Steve Case alone reported at nearly $500 million. Then the Ponzi peaked and had to be reset. In 2002, the combined company wrote off nearly $100 billion of goodwill, the largest annual loss in American corporate history to that date, and by 2003, the letters AOL were removed from the name like a tag from a toe. Who absorbed the $100 billion? Time Warner's legacy shareholders, and behind them the index funds, the mutual funds, the pension plans, the standing bid, which by construction had been maximally exposed at the peak. The insiders exited through the turnstile the retirement system is built to hold open. That was 2000, when index funds held perhaps a tenth of the market. Today, passive vehicles hold roughly half of American fund assets, and the largest handful of stocks again make up roughly a third of the index. The turnstile has never been wider. This is not a prediction and not an accusation. It is a description of plumbing. The phrase is not a metaphor about fairness. It is an account of flows. Concentrated, informed money exits at tops. Diffuse, automatic money absorbs. Corporate penalties for the conduct that inflated the top are then paid by the absorbers. The profits are private. The risk is in your retirement statement. The short and distort campaign taken to its extreme can do the opposite, which is keep a stock out of the index funds by keeping its market cap low. There are gatekeepers to this massive pile of unwatched retirement money, and those gatekeepers can pick which companies live or die. Chapter 8, The Files. In November 2025, Congress passed, and the President signed, the Epstein Files Transparency Act, ordering the Justice Department to open its holdings. On January 30, 2026, the department began releasing more than 3 million pages of documents, plus photographs and videos, into a public, searchable library. Resignations followed within weeks. What the released record and the official proceedings around it now establish about Epstein and the machinery of money and law is set out below, the documents speaking largely for themselves. What are the odds that the same year, 2004, that Trump banned Epstein from Mar-a-Lago, his company DJT was shorted into the ground? The Department of Justice and FBI records indicate that Trump allegedly contacted then Palm Beach Police Chief Michael Reiter by phone in July 2006 to praise the investigation and state that everyone knew about Jeffrey Epstein's behavior. Then in 2008, Trump helped with the investigation. For anyone who has actually read the Epstein files, it is very clear that his inner circles were all the same short-selling globalist bankers. Trump then said the infamous line when asked about Jeffrey Epstein, "Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein?" Donald Trump's own son literally said years prior, "Never stop talking about Jeffrey Epstein." So what happened? It could have been plea deals, but likely it was to get the group who had never cared about Epstein to research it. It produced more irony than results, because none of the Democrats actually dug in and researched Epstein, but they did at least get loud about it. And in the history books, it will go down as the biggest and most effective troll of all time, because almost every single person in Epstein's inner circles were deeply involved in the Democrat Party. Start with the person who Epstein emailed the most. Catherine Rumler served as White House counsel to President Obama until May 2014 and met Epstein that year, while a partner at Latham & Watkins. She later became chief legal officer of Goldman Sachs and served on FINRA's board of governors. By the government's own release, she appears in the files roughly 10,000 times. The emails show a relationship she would later call professional. She addressed him as Uncle Jeffrey. She wrote of him, "I adore him." He showered her with gifts that congressional correspondents would later itemize, and Herm's handbag valued above $9,000, $10,000 in Bergdorf Goodman cards, a Fendi coat, an Apple Watch. The files show business flowing through the friendship. In August 2014, Epstein referred her a client, the Swiss private bank Edmond de Rothschild, writing that it had a Justice Department problem, and she took the engagement at Latham. They show proximity to power flowing through it too. In October 2014, months after leaving the White House and while under public consideration for Attorney General of the United States, she sent Epstein a draft of her statement withdrawing from consideration and asked for his feedback. This was 6 years after his conviction, while he was a registered sex offender. Then the aftermath, which is itself now part of the record. Goldman Sachs publicly defended its top lawyer after the release. Less than 2 weeks later, she announced her resignation, effective June 30, 2026. In June, the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee and the ranking member of a House Oversight Subcommittee wrote formally to Goldman's chief executive, demanding answers about reports that he had asked her to stay on as an advisor regardless, a letter that recites the gifts and the contacts item by item on Senate letterhead. In July 2026, she testified to the House's Epstein investigation, its 17th witness. Whatever else is true, this much is in the congressional record. The General Counsel of Goldman Sachs, a former White House counsel and FINRA governor, was examined under oath about her relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and left the bank because of what the government's files contained. Now the payer, because the files era also produced the hardest number in the entire Epstein finance record, and it came from Wall Street's own investigation of itself. In 2021, Apollo Global Management's board received the review it had commissioned from the law firm DeChert into its co-founders' dealings with Epstein. The review's finding: Leon Black had personally paid Epstein $158 million between 2012 and 2017. After the conviction, after the registration, for tax and estate planning services. $158 million from one of the most powerful men in American finance to a registered sex offender for advice. Black denied wrongdoing, and the review found the payments were for legitimate services. He nonetheless stepped down from the firm he built, and the Senate Finance Committee spent the following years probing the tax structures the money touched. Whatever the services were worth, the receipt established one fact plainly: the idea that serious finance kept its distance from Epstein after 2008 is not merely wrong. It is refuted by 9 figures in a document Apollo itself commissioned. The wider fallout confirms the pattern was systemic rather than personal. In the release Wave of 2025-26, the executive chairman of Hyatt resigned after documents showed continued meals and correspondence with Epstein long after the conviction. A former Treasury secretary withdrew from public commitments after his emails surfaced. The British Crown stripped a prince of his titles. And the files re-established, in primary documents, the origin of Epstein's fortune. Les Wexner's wealth was the source Epstein managed and the seed of everything. Last, the forward edge. The House Oversight Committee has stated that further productions are still coming from Epstein's estate and from the banking institutions he did business with and has pledged to publish them. J.P. Morgan and Deutsche Bank have already paid, in settlements, for banking Epstein. The coming productions are the underlying paper. The Justice Department's Epstein Library is live and searchable today. For years, this material had to be assembled from fragments at the edge of the public record. The center of the record is now opening, on a statutory schedule, and anyone can search it. Chapter 9, The Great Pivot: How Sanction Stripping Created the Ghost Share Ledger. The death of the clean wire. In June 2014, the U.S. Department of Justice announced a historic $8.9 billion guilty plea against the French banking giant BNP Paribas for systematically violating U.S. economic sanctions. The bank had conspired to process billions of dollars of illicit transactions through the American financial system on behalf of blacklisted regimes, most notably Iran. To bypass regulatory oversight, BNP Paribas utilized a sophisticated technique known as data stripping, deliberately removing identifying customer names and personal data from international wire transfers to obscure the Iranian origin of the funds. While this method successfully moved billions under the radar for years, the rapid digitization of global banking networks eventually made the digital paper trail too visible to ignore, culminating in catastrophic regulatory crackdowns. For the international financial institutions laundering black market capital, the traditional bank wire was officially dead. The penalties were escalating too fast, and the SWIFT system had become a glass house. To survive, the global black market desperately needed a new, untraceable medium to move, park, and store capital. The perfect ledger: shorted shares. The replacement for the traditional wire transfer was found in the unregulated gaps of the Wall Street clearing system: shorted shares. Under standard market mechanics, short selling involves borrowing a security and selling it onto the open market with the obligation to buy it back later. However, the rules of tax and accounting contain a massive loophole. A short seller does not have to report or pay taxes on their gains until they formally close their short position. If a financial institution targets a company, floods the market with counterfeit shares to suppress its price, and drives the business into bankruptcy, those shares trade at a fraction of a cent indefinitely. Because the targeted company is dead, the short position never has to be closed, meaning the profits are never taxed and the underlying capital never has to be returned. By exploiting these mechanics, the global banking elite realized they could use shorted shares as a parallel, untraceable currency. It functioned as an infinite, tax-free, interest-free loan that left no visible trail on standard bank balance sheets. The obscure catalyst, Torchlight 2014. The proof of concept for this new financial ledger began in 2014 with a tiny, highly obscure penny stock called Torchlight Energy Resources. As the BNP Paribas prosecution forced the black market to seek alternative vehicles, Jeffrey Epstein quietly began accumulating a massive position in Torchlight shares. At the exact same time, Jeff Yass's Susquehanna International Group, SIG, one of the largest market makers in the United States, established a permanent, foundational inventory in the very same obscure oil and gas penny stock. The geographic hub for this operation was the Cayman Islands, a primary tax haven where both Epstein and George Soros maintained their secret, off-the-books bank accounts. Epstein managed his holdings through a Cayman-registered hedge fund called Liquid Funding Limited, whose board of directors was heavily composed of prominent Austrian bankers. Because these shares were held in offshore, multi-layered custody accounts, the syndicate could lend out the same physical block of stock to multiple different counterparties simultaneously. This process of infinite rehypothecation allowed them to print synthetic borrow locates out of thin air, generating billions of dollars in untraceable, counterfeit equity that could be routed around the world to wash black market capital. The test run was complete, and the stage was set for a multi-decade war on retail investors. The record. The BNP Paribas plea is a matter of public record. In 2014, the bank agreed to plead guilty and pay $8.9 billion, at the time the largest penalty ever imposed in a sanctions case, after admitting it stripped identifying data from wire transfers to move funds for Sudan, Iran, and Cuba through the U.S. financial system. The findings are set out in the Justice Department's plea agreement. BNP was one entry in a long sequence of the same conduct, documented case by case. Wachovia entered a deferred prosecution agreement in 2010, admitting it failed to monitor roughly $378 billion moving through Mexican currency exchanges tied to drug cartels, and paid $160 million. HSBC admitted in 2012 to laundering for the Sinaloa cartel and paid $1.9 billion, the case that put the phrase, "too big to jail," into circulation. Standard Chartered was penalized in 2012 and again in 2019 for stripping Iranian transaction data, the same technique. Deutsche Bank paid roughly $630 million in 2017 over mirror trades that relocated $10 billion out of Russia. A Goldman Sachs subsidiary pleaded guilty in the 1MDB sovereign fund looting, with U.S. penalties above $2.9 billion. Danske Bank pleaded guilty in the United States in 2022 after roughly 200 billion euros in suspicious flows passed through a single Estonian branch. In October 2024, TD Bank became the first bank in American history to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering, not a monitoring failure, but the conspiracy itself. After trafficking networks, including fentanyl operations, moved hundreds of millions through the bank, while employees accepted gift card bribes. The penalties reached $3.09 billion, and regulators imposed a rare asset cap. Each of these is a signed settlement or guilty plea in the public record. Two underlying facts are also documented. Gains on an open short position are generally not recognized for tax until the position is closed. The deferral is a real feature of the Internal Revenue Code. And naked shorting with persistent settlement failures appears throughout the SEC's own enforcement history. The Rhino Advisors Sedona matter in 2003, the regulation show threshold security lists the Commission began publishing in 2005, and the fails to deliver data showing failures peaking in the billions of dollars per day during 2008. Merrill Lynch paid $20 million in 2016 to settle claims it facilitated naked short selling, and the unsealed discovery in the Overstock litigation placed broker communications about delivery compliance into the court record. On the Torchlight thread, The corporate facts are on the record. Torchlight Energy became Metamaterials in a June 2021 reverse merger, and the resulting MMTLP ticker became the subject of a FINRA trading halt in December 2022. Exactly what happened is not certain, but it has already been confirmed that brokers sold more shares than they had. Chapter 9, The Great Pivot, How Sanction Stripping Created the Ghost Share Ledger. The Death of the Clean Wire. In June 2014, the U.S. Department of Justice announced a historic $8.9 billion guilty plea against the French banking giant BNP Paribas for systematically violating U.S. economic sanctions. The bank had conspired to process billions of dollars of illicit transactions through the American financial system on behalf of blacklisted regimes, most notably Iran. To bypass regulatory oversight, BNP Paribas utilized a sophisticated technique known as data stripping, deliberately removing identifying customer names and personal data from international wire transfers to obscure the Iranian origin of the funds. While this method successfully moved billions under the radar for years, the rapid digitization of global banking networks eventually made the digital paper trail too visible to ignore, culminating in catastrophic regulatory crackdowns. For the international financial institutions laundering black market capital, the traditional bank wire was officially dead. The penalties were escalating too fast, and the SWIFT system had become a glass house. To survive, the global black market desperately needed a new, untraceable medium to move, park, and store capital. The perfect ledger: shorted shares. The replacement for the traditional wire transfer was found in the unregulated gaps of the Wall Street clearing system: shorted shares. Under standard market mechanics, short selling involves borrowing a security and selling it onto the open market with the obligation to buy it back later. However, the rules of tax and accounting contain a massive loophole. A short seller does not have to report or pay taxes on their gains until they formally close their short position. If a financial institution targets a company, floods the market with counterfeit shares to suppress its price, and drives the business into bankruptcy, those shares trade at a fraction of a cent indefinitely. Because the targeted company is dead, the short position never has to be closed, meaning the profits are never taxed and the underlying capital never has to be returned. By exploiting these mechanics, the global banking elite realized they could use shorted shares as a parallel, untraceable currency. It functioned as an infinite, tax-free, interest-free loan that left no visible trail on standard bank balance sheets. The obscure catalyst: Torchlight 2014. The proof of concept for this new financial ledger began in 2014 with a tiny, highly obscure penny stock called Torchlight Energy Resources. As the BNP Paribas prosecution forced the black market to seek alternative vehicles, Jeffrey Epstein quietly began accumulating a massive position in Torchlight shares. At the exact same time, Jeff Yass's Susquehanna International Group, SIG, one of the largest market makers in the United States, established a permanent, foundational inventory in the very same obscure oil and gas penny stock. The geographic hub for this operation was the Cayman Islands, a primary tax haven where both Epstein and George Soros maintained their secret, off-the-books bank accounts. Epstein managed his holdings through a Cayman-registered hedge fund called Liquid Funding Limited, whose board of directors was heavily composed of prominent Austrian bankers. Because these shares were held in offshore, multi-layered custody accounts, the syndicate could lend out the same physical block of stock to multiple different counterparties simultaneously. This process of infinite rehypothecation allowed them to print synthetic borrow locates out of thin air, generating billions of dollars in untraceable counterfeit equity that could be routed around the world to wash black market capital. The test run was complete, and the stage was set for a multi-decade war on retail investors. The record. The BNP Paribas plea is a matter of public record. In 2014, the bank agreed to plead guilty and pay $8.9 billion, at the time the largest penalty ever imposed in a sanctions case, after admitting it stripped identifying data from wire transfers to move funds for Sudan, Iran, and Cuba through the U.S. financial system. The findings are set out in the Justice Department's plea agreement. BNP was one entry in a long sequence of the same conduct, documented case by case. Wachovia entered a deferred prosecution agreement in 2010, admitting it failed to monitor roughly $378 billion moving through Mexican currency exchanges tied to drug cartels, and paid $160 million. HSBC admitted in 2012 to laundering for the Sinaloa cartel and paid $1.9 billion. The case that put the phrase, "too big to jail," into circulation. Standard Chartered was penalized in 2012 and again in 2019 for stripping Iranian transaction data, the same technique. Deutsche Bank paid roughly $630 million in 2017 over mirror trades that relocated $10 billion out of Russia. A Goldman Sachs subsidiary pleaded guilty in the 1MDB sovereign fund looting, with U.S. penalties above $2.9 billion. Danske Bank pleaded guilty in the United States in 2022 after roughly 200 billion euros in suspicious flows passed through a single Estonian branch. In October 2024, TD Bank became the first bank in American history to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering, not a monitoring failure, but the conspiracy itself. After trafficking networks, including fentanyl operations, moved hundreds of millions through the bank, while employees accepted gift card bribes. The penalties reached $3.09 billion, and regulators imposed a rare asset cap. Each of these is a signed settlement or guilty plea in the public record. Two underlying facts are also documented. Gains on an open short position are generally not recognized for tax until the position is closed. The deferral is a real feature of the Internal Revenue Code. And naked shorting with persistent settlement failures appears throughout the SEC's own enforcement history. The Rhino Advisors Sedona matter in 2003, the regulations show threshold security lists the Commission began publishing in 2005, and the fails to deliver data showing failures peaking in the billions of dollars per day during 2008. Merrill Lynch paid $20 million in 2016 to settle claims it facilitated naked short selling, and the unsealed discovery in the Overstock litigation placed broker communications about delivery compliance into the court record. On the Torchlight thread, the corporate facts are on the record. Torchlight Energy became Metamaterials in a June 2021 reverse merger, and the resulting MMTLP ticker became the subject of a FINRA trading halt in December 2022. Exactly what happened is not certain, but it has already been confirmed that brokers sold more shares than they had. Chapter 10, The Synthetic Pipeline, Dark Pools, ATS, and Tokenized Locates, 2019-2021. The dark venues, smart routing and alternative trading systems. As the Ghost Ledger grew, the syndicate required an advanced infrastructure that could bypass standard exchange reporting. They found their answer in alternative trading systems, ATS, and dark pools. Unlike public stock exchanges, where bids, offers, and transactions are visible, an ATS operates as an unregulated, off-the-books venue where financial institutions select their own counterparties and execute massive block trades in complete secrecy. At the center of this pipeline was J.P. Morgan Chase, operating proprietary ATS platforms like JPMX. These platforms utilized sophisticated smart order routing, SOR, and low-latency microwave signals to transmit and compute trading signals at high-frequency speeds. By utilizing these low-latency algorithms, the syndicate's computers could anticipate competitors' trades and manipulate prices within tight, artificial trading ranges, a process known as bar coding or channeling. If a trade went the wrong way, the ATS allowed the operator to exploit the Alternative Display Facility, ADF. By playing a digital game of hot potato, the syndicate shuffled risk between a chain of shell companies and broker-dealers, delaying settlement and effectively washing the underlying securities before any failure to deliver could ever be reported to the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, DTCC. The Belarus connection and tokenized synthetics. While dark pools allowed the syndicate to hide their daily transactions, they still faced a structural hurdle. To short U.S. equities, they legally needed a borrow locate. To generate these locates infinitely, the syndicate merged Wall Street's clearing loopholes with the unregulated cryptocurrency market. In 2018, the management consultancy Oliver Wyman, which later hired former SEC trading and markets director Haixing Zhu, began setting up a cryptocurrency pathway for tokenized shares with China. This pathway was launched in May 2019 through Currency.com, later rebranded as Dzengi.com, a tokenized securities exchange based out of Belarus. This location was highly strategic. Belarus was the very country where Karina Shuliak, the romantic partner to whom Jeffrey Epstein left his fortune, was actively being positioned to become a national oligarch. These platforms did not trade real U.S. shares. Instead, they sold tokenized derivatives, contract for difference, CFD, products that simply tracked the prices of heavily shorted U.S. retail stocks like AMC, GameStop, and Bed Bath & Beyond. Because these tokens existed purely on private blockchains, there was no public regulatory oversight. Yet, through a massive regulatory loophole, financial institutions were permitted to use these tokenized synthetic derivatives as valid borrow-locates to back their naked short positions on Wall Street. Bypassing the DTCC, the FTX liquidity mirage. By February 2021, the synthetic locate pipeline was scaled to the global public through Sam Bankman-Fried's FTX and Binance. Central to this operation was Brett Harrison, the president of FTX US, who had been hired directly from Citadel Securities. Harrison possessed the exact technical expertise required to interface high-frequency algorithmic systems with tokenized locates. Through FTX, billions of dollars of one-to-one backed, tokenized GME, AMC, and BBBYQ shares were minted. In reality, these tokens were completely unbacked synthetic placeholders. They served a dual purpose. First, they acted as fake assets on the balance sheets of over-leveraged hedge funds to meet margin requirements. Second, they allowed market makers to execute a digital form of check kiting. Under regulation shows bona fide market maker exemption, market makers like Virtu Financial, led by former Paul Weiss lawyer Doug Sifu, and Susquehanna SIG, were granted a 35-day window to locate a borrow for a trade. By bouncing synthetic locates generated by FTX and Belarusian tokens back and forth, the market makers could infinitely kick the can, resetting the 35-day settlement clock. Standard retail investors buying shares believed they were acquiring real equity, when in fact, they were buying unsettled, counterfeit digital IUs designed to systematically siphon their wealth into offshore Cayman accounts. The venues and firms named here have documented enforcement histories for concealment, even where the specific mechanism described goes beyond anything a regulator has charged. Dark pools have been sanctioned for misrepresenting what happens inside them. Barclays and Credit Suisse paid $154 million combined in 2016 to the SEC and the New York Attorney General over misrepresentations to clients about how they policed predatory high-frequency trading. ITG paid $20.3 million in 2015 for operating a secret proprietary desk that traded against its own pool's customers. UBS and Deutsche Bank paid separately over their own dark pools. J.P. Morgan operates a registered alternative trading system that appears in FINRA's ATS transparency data. J.P. Morgan's market conduct is documented. In September 2020, the bank admitted to 8 years of manipulative spoofing in the precious metals and treasury markets and paid $920 million. $2 of its traders were convicted at trial in 2022 and imprisoned. J.P. Morgan also served as Bernard Madoff's primary bank for decades and paid $2.6 billion in 2014 under a deferred prosecution agreement for failing to act on its own internal warnings. The market makers have their own records. In August 2023, the SEC sanctioned Citadel Securities for marking millions of short sale orders as long over a 5-year period, a regulation show violation, short sales recorded as their opposite. Virtu Financial was charged by the SEC in 2023 over information barrier failures alleged to have let broad groups of employees reach confidential customer order information. The offshore and tokenized infrastructure exists in verifiable form. Currency.com launched in 2019 as a Belarus-based tokenized securities platform offering instruments that tracked U.S. equities. FTX ran a tokenized stock program through German and Swiss intermediaries, offering tokens that tracked shares including GameStop and AMC. After FTX collapsed, the backing of those tokens was among the questions raised in bankruptcy. The FTX trial established that these systems can be rigged internally. Alameda Research held a code-level exemption from FTX's liquidation engine and a secret multi-billion-dollar line of credit, both testified to under oath by FTX insiders, and Sam Bankman-Fried was convicted on all counts in November 2023. Brett Harrison came to FTX from Citadel Securities. Chapter 11, The Red Theater, the Obama-China AMC Pipeline and the Synthetic Short Mirage. The Sidley-Austin Gateway and the Cayman Shells. To map how Wall Street's synthetic share ledger integrated with foreign state actors, the trail leads directly to the elite legal corridors of Chicago and Washington, D.C., Sidley-Austin. The prestigious law firm, where both Barack Obama and Michelle Obama began their careers, is legally registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, as a foreign agent for the government of the Cayman Islands. This relationship is highly strategic. The Cayman Islands serve as the primary offshore tax haven where Jeffrey Epstein, George Soros, and their hedge fund affiliates operated the secret, off-the-books bank accounts used to fund aggressive shorting campaigns against American businesses. By embedding connected legal professionals within the highest echelons of the executive branch, the syndicate established a regulatory force field. While Sidley-Austin managed representation for offshore tax havens and Chinese state-linked apparatuses, representing high-risk entities like Hikvision, adjacent Tier 3 firms like Latham & Watkins and Davis Polk positioned key regulatory actors. This legal pipeline successfully placed Catherine Rumler as Obama's White House counsel and later as a partner at Goldman Sachs and a FINRA governor, where she oversaw a balance sheet holding over $274 billion in securities sold, but not yet purchased. The Beijing ticket, how the CCP captured America's screens. During the Obama administration, a massive geopolitical shift occurred in the domestic entertainment industry. The White House permitted Chinese state-linked conglomerates to systematically purchase major American movie theater chains. Foremost among these acquisitions was the Wanda Group's purchase of AMC theaters. Wanda Group, a Chinese multinational conglomerate, was led by Wang Jianlin, a high-ranking veteran of the People's Liberation Army, PLA, and a delegate to the Chinese National People's Congress. Wanda Group quickly secured an 80% controlling stake in AMC, initiating a classic corporate asset stripping playbook. Under Chinese control, AMC's cash reserves were systematically drained through aggressive cash dividends. Crucially, Wanda enacted a real estate net lease strategy. They sold off AMC's valuable physical real estate holdings for pennies on the dollar to friendly investment entities, such as EPR Properties, co-founded by AMC board member Peter Brown, and then forced the public company to lease its own theaters back at highly inflated, unsustainable rates. To ensure the public company was permanently saddled with debt, AMC's board, which included Peter Brown, an executive managing multiple companies for Apollo Global Management, the private equity giant that funded Jeffrey Epstein through billionaire Leon Black, coordinated with Epstein-tied private equity firms like Silver Lake Capital to execute highly dilutive debt-to-equity conversions. This structural hollowing out left the theater chain highly vulnerable, setting the stage for a massive, short, and distort campaign when the 2020 pandemic forced theater doors to close. The MIT Oliver Wyman pipeline. While AMC's physical assets were being stripped from the inside, the financial architecture to infinitely short its stock was being engineered offshore. In 2018, the global management consultancy Oliver Wyman began developing a highly sophisticated cryptocurrency pathway designed to interface with Chinese capital and facilitate tokenized shares on foreign exchanges. Coordinating this effort was Haixiang Zhu, a former MIT Sloan professor who transitioned directly from his academic post to become the director of the Division of Trading and Markets at the SEC. Zhu maintained deep scholarly and professional ties with high-ranking Chinese economists, session-chairing financial conferences with John Rogers, a senior Federal Reserve advisor who was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit economic espionage for stealing and transmitting sensitive trade secrets to the Chinese intelligence apparatus. Under the guise of financial innovation, Oliver Wyman's cryptocurrency pathway was launched in May 2019 out of currency.com, later rebranded as dzengi.com, a digital securities exchange based in Belarus. Belarus was chosen as the operational launchpad because Karina Shuliak, Jeffrey Epstein's romantic partner to whom he attempted to leave a $100 million fortune, was actively being positioned by the syndicate to become a national oligarch in the region. By trading unbacked, contract for difference, CFD, AMC, tokens on these unregulated Belarusian and Eastern European exchanges, the syndicate generated a massive shadow pool of synthetic securities. These tokens were then ported into the United States through cryptocurrency exchanges like FTX and Binance. Under SEC loopholes left unaddressed by regulators, U.S. prime brokers and market makers were permitted to cite these unbacked foreign tokens as valid borrow locates. This allowed them to print billions of counterfeit, naked short shares of AMC, suppressing the stock price and driving retail investors to act as exit liquidity. The family Loop Capital and the Soros Short. The final claw of the AMC bustout was executed through a highly coordinated media and financial campaign designed to drive the stock price to absolute zero. Central to this short-selling effort was Loop Capital, a prominent investment bank and hedge fund where Craig Robinson, the brother-in-law of Barack Obama, is an executive. Loop Capital operated in tandem with the Cayman-registered shorting syndicates established by George Soros, deploying analysts like Alan Good to execute aggressive short and distort campaigns. Throughout the early days of the pandemic, Loop Capital repeatedly downgraded AMC, slapping the stock with an unprecedented $1.10 price target and warning the public that bankruptcy was a distinct possibility. This coordinated pressure was designed to trigger panic selling among retail investors, allowing the market-making syndicate to quietly cover their massive failures to deliver. However, because the syndicate's short positions were exponentially larger than AMC's actual outstanding float, the sudden emergence of millions of retail apes buying and holding the stock completely broke the settlement clock. The resulting meme stock explosion trapped billions of dollars in unbacked tokenized liabilities across the global banking system, turning what was supposed to be a standard, profitable corporate execution into a liability nightmare for the bank's part of the scheme. Chapter 12, Infiltrating the Host, the Inward Demise and Boardroom Coup of Bed Bath & Beyond. The Boardroom Coup, Strategic Infiltration. The standard mafia bust-out playbook dictates that a company cannot be destroyed from the outside alone. It must be systematically dismantled from within. In 2019, the syndicate initiated its infiltration of Bed Bath & Beyond, BBBY, by installing Mark Tritton, the former chief executive officer of Target, as CEO. Tritton was not alone. The board also included Harriet Edelman, an executive with deep ties to the Robin Hood Foundation, the massive New York organization backed by major short-selling entities like Citadel. From day one, Tritton and the board enacted corporate strategies that directly crippled the company's financial health. Under the guise of modernization, Tritton brought in Boston Consulting Group, BCG, and implemented a highly expensive, proprietary e-commerce solution called Blue Yonder. Strangely, this e-commerce overhaul catastrophically failed during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, a period when competitors like Wayfair saw historic, record-breaking online sales. Simultaneously, the board began aggressively stripping BBBY's most valuable assets. The company sold off its entire real estate portfolio, valued at approximately $1 billion, for a mere $250 million to connected private equity and real estate firms, including Blue Owl, a firm with direct ties to Jeffrey Epstein's network, Oak Street, and KKR. Bed Bath & Beyond was then forced to lease its own buildings back at highly inflated, unsustainable rates. One by one, profitable subsidiaries like World Market and Christmas Tree Shops were carved up and sold off, leaving the parent company completely hollowed out and saddled with immense debt. The liquidity siphon, share buybacks, and the J.P. Morgan trap. To ensure the public company could never recover, the board executed an aggressive $1.5 billion share buyback program. In a highly anomalous move in 2020, the board completely eliminated BBBY's shareholder dividend while simultaneously maintaining these massive share buybacks. From an accounting standpoint, this maneuver made no sense. If a company is too cash poor to afford offering a dividend, it cannot afford to buy back its own stock. However, the real incentive was to shield the short-selling syndicate. If more than 100% of the company's shares had been naked shorted, a dividend payout would have forced the market makers to pay dividends on millions of counterfeit phantom shares, exposing the entire check-kiting scheme. With its real estate sold and cash reserves completely drained by the buybacks, Bed Bath & Beyond became entirely dependent on outside financing. The trap was formally sprung when the board secured a $500 million asset-backed loan, ABL, from J.P. Morgan Chase. J.P. Morgan structured the loan with highly restrictive cash sweep provisions. This gave the bank the legal authority to instantly seize BBBY's incoming revenues to pay down the debt whenever J.P. Morgan chose. By weaponizing this loan structure, J.P. Morgan effectively locked the company's operating capital, preventing Bed Bath & Beyond from purchasing inventory to fill its shelves for 2 consecutive Christmas holiday seasons. The empty shelves destroyed customer confidence, accelerating the pre-planned slide toward bankruptcy. The battle for Bye Bye Baby, Cohen versus Freeman. In March 2022, GameStop CEO Ryan Cohen stepped in to intercept the bust-out, purchasing a 10% activist stake in BBBY. Cohen's primary objective was to unlock the massive hidden value of Bye Bye Baby, BBBY's highly valuable infant retail subsidiary. Cohen wrote an open letter to the board demanding they spin off or sell Bye Bye Baby to salvage shareholder equity. The board's response was swift and defensive. Mark Tritton authorized an emergency $40 million share buyback, which artificially inflated the price of the stock and pushed Cohen's holdings past the critical 10% threshold. This legally designated Cohen as an insider, effectively blocking him from making an outside acquisition offer on Bye Bye Baby. To regain his operational flexibility and escape the insider trap, Cohen was forced to sell his entire position, after which the corporate media immediately weaponized the sale to accuse him of a pump and dump scheme. The true pump and dump was occurring on the other side of the ledger. A college student named Jake Freeman, acting through Freeman Capital, quietly acquired a massive position in BBBY bonds and debt prior to the run-up and exited at the absolute peak, netting over $100 million. Crucially, Freeman had previously co-authored an academic paper in connection with Credit Suisse detailing a highly sophisticated strategy to bet against distressed companies. The strategy involved buying up a company's bonds, purchasing credit default swaps or total return swaps, TRS, to bet on bankruptcy, and then using the bondholder voting power to veto any restructuring plans that could potentially save the company. Following Cohen's exit, the board installed Sue Gove as CEO. Rather than pursuing a standard restructuring, Gove's administration engaged in a highly dilutive financing deal with B. Riley and Hudson Bay Capital. Preferred shares were generated and instantly dumped onto the market, acting as a mechanism to retroactively cover massive failures to deliver that had already been executed by short sellers. Despite collecting these funds, the board voluntarily declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2023. However, because the settlements were kept off the public books, the bankruptcy transformed into a highly complex, ongoing RICO reorganization, leaving billions of dollars in unresolved total return swaps still hanging over the global financial system. Chapter 13, the Cayman Loophole, Multi-Custody Rehypothecation, and the ETF XRT Shell Game. The Cayman Laundromat and Liquid Funding Limited. The offshore clearing system of the Cayman Islands has long served as the primary financial sanctuary for the global black market. It was here that George Soros originally designed the offshore shorting mechanism, establishing a network of multi-layered shell companies and off-the-books bank accounts that Jeffrey Epstein and his hedge fund affiliates later adopted. The primary clearing vehicle for this offshore syndicate was Liquid Funding Limited, a Cayman-registered fund whose board of directors was heavily composed of prominent Austrian bankers. Under the cover of Rule 17F5, the SEC's foreign custody exemption, this offshore structure allowed the syndicate to hold U.S. equities in foreign jurisdictions where they were completely shielded from domestic clearinghouse oversight. Because these shares were held in offshore custody accounts, the syndicate was not bound by standard settlement reporting. This regulatory blind spot allowed them to execute a process of infinite rehypothecation, lending out the exact same physical block of stock to multiple counterparties simultaneously. This generated billions of dollars in synthetic borrow locates out of thin air, forming a parallel ledger where capital could be laundered tax-free without ever reporting a trade to the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, DTCC. Jeff Yass, Susquehanna, and the Torchlight baseline. The structural foundation of this parallel ledger relied on targeting stocks that could be intentionally bankrupted because they could short infinitely without ever having to close that short position. As early as 2014, both Jeffrey Epstein and Jeff Yass's Susquehanna International Group, SIG, had established massive baseline positions in the very same penny stock, Torchlight Energy Resources, TRCH. Susquehanna was the designated market maker for it. For a major market maker like SIG, which maintains a permanent, foundational inventory of thousands of equities to facilitate daily market liquidity, acquiring a heavy baseline position in an obscure oil and gas penny stock was highly anomalous. However, Torchlight served as the perfect test vehicle. Because its shares were illiquid and held primarily in Cayman-registered entities, they could be leveraged to generate infinite synthetic locates. By exploiting the regulation show bona fide market maker exemption, firms like SIG, Citadel, and Virtu Financial, led by former Paul Weiss lawyer Doug Sifu, could sell Torchlight shares to retail investors without actually owning them or securing a borrow. When the 35-day settlement deadline approached, instead of purchasing real shares to settle the trade, the market makers utilized a digital check kiting scheme, bouncing the settlement obligations back and forth between each other. The short positions remained open indefinitely, allowing the syndicate to keep the untaxed cash proceeds parked in offshore Cayman accounts. The ETF XRT shell game. As retail investors began exposing the naked shorting of individual equities, the syndicate evolved its strategy, shifting its focus to exchange-traded funds, ETFs. The primary weapon in this new phase was the SPDR S&P Retail ETF, XRT. Under standard ETF creation and redemption mechanics, market makers can perform operational shorting. If a specific retail stock inside the ETF, such as GameStop, Bed Bath & Beyond, or AMC, is targeted for a bust-out, the market maker borrows a share of the ETF, breaks open the basket, and extracts the target stock to cover their naked short positions on the public exchange. They then replace the extracted stock with a cash equivalent, leaving the ETF structurally hollowed out. This mechanism allows the syndicate to bypass standard regulation, show borrow fees, and hide their failures to deliver within the complex, ex-clearing reporting structures of the ETF. This explains how XRT has maintained an unprecedented, reported short interest of over 250% for over 5 consecutive years, occasionally spiking as high as 1,305% of its total outstanding shares. To prevent regulatory intervention, the syndicate positioned Canadian teacher pension funds, which operate outside SEC jurisdiction, as the largest holders of XRT to act as a permanent, unquestioned source of stock lending liquidity. To protect this multi-billion-dollar pipeline from legislative scrutiny, Jeff Yass became the primary financial backer of key libertarian-leaning politicians, pumping over $7.5 million into super PACs that directly funded the campaigns of representatives like Thomas Massey. The capture of the system extended directly into the family networks of the regulators and politicians themselves. Massey's daughter-in-law, Sophie Massey, an MIT-trained quantitative trader, worked at the major quantitative firm Jane Street, where she actively designed and launched proprietary ETF products. By placing connected insiders at every stage of the pipeline, from the brokers and market makers to the politicians and regulatory boards, the syndicate successfully insulated their global counterfeiting scheme from the rule of law. Chapter 14, The Pedigree of Capture, Pequot Capital, Whistleblower Silencing, and the SEC's Legacy Shield. The Aguara Whistleblower Blueprint. To understand the speed and coordination with which the SEC and FINRA acted to halt MMTLP in December 2022, one must look back to 2005. The blueprint for silencing investigations into the financial elite was perfected during the SEC's investigation of Pequot Capital Management, a massive hedge fund founded by Arthur Samberg. Gary Aguara, a highly diligent SEC enforcement attorney, was leading a high-stakes insider trading probe into Pequot. The evidence led Aguara directly to John Mack, the former CEO of Morgan Stanley and a senior advisor to Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, KKR. When Aguara prepared subpoenas to depose Mack, his superior, SEC Assistant Director of Enforcement Mark Kreitman, actively blocked the subpoenas. When Aguara refused to back down, the SEC fired him. The agency and Kreitman utilized defensive, administrative language to justify the termination, claiming Aguara was resistant to supervision and insufficiently cognizant of institutional protocol. An independent investigation later revealed that the SEC had terminated Aguara specifically to protect Mack, but the institutional cover-up held firm. By firing the lead investigator, the SEC signaled to its entire staff that protecting Wall Street titans was the primary prerequisite for career survival. The Epstein-Rothschild venture connection. The extreme measures taken by senior SEC officials to protect Pequot Capital become clear when tracking the fund's underlying capital structure. Pequot was originally established as a spin-off from Firstmark Capital. Firstmark served as the primary private investment vehicle for Lynn Forrester de Rothschild. According to unsealed documents, Lynn Forrester de Rothschild maintained a highly intimate relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was deeply involved in Firstmark's advisory network, which also included Kenneth I. Starr, the notorious Ponzi schemer who served as Lady Rothschild's personal financial advisor. Furthermore, Mortimer Zuckerman, a prominent media billionaire listed in Epstein's private birthday book, was a primary anchor investor in these specific funds. By shielding John Mack and Pequot Capital, Mark Kreitman was not merely protecting a single Wall Street executive. He was actively insulating the foundational financial vehicles of the Epstein-Rothschild offshore network from forensic discovery. The Administrative Kangaroo Court. When the Office of the Inspector General, OIG, subsequently investigated the retaliatory firing of Gary Aguara and recommended disciplinary action against the complicit SEC supervisors, the administrative state deployed its final defensive shield. Administrative Law Judge Brenda Murray. Judge Murray overrode the OIG's findings, ruling that the SEC did not fail in its duties and blocking any reprimands for Mark Kreitman or his colleagues. Murray's role as a protector of the administrative status quo is tied directly to globalist institutions. She served as president of the National Association of Women Judges, NAWJ, which is partnered with the Elders, the globalist organization founded by Richard Branson, a close Epstein associate who hosted Epstein's harem of underage girls on his private island. Another primary, thought partner of Murray's judicial association was the Open Government Partnership, directed in the UK by Francis Maud, a member of the elite Trilateral Commission on which Jeffrey Epstein himself sat. The judicial body tasked with keeping the SEC honest was, in reality, deeply embedded in the same elite network of globalist influence. Sai Rao and the Lineage of Protection, 2020-2023. The multi-generational pedigree of this regulatory capture is personified in Sai Rao, the securities policy official at the SEC. On December 9, 2022, FINRA enacted the unprecedented U3 halt on MMTLP, blocking retail investors from trading during the final 2 days before the stock was scheduled to go private. This occurred immediately after Howard Mayerson of the Financial Information Forum, representing the major short-selling brokerages, emailed Sai Rao and other SEC officials. Mayerson's email delivered a stark warning. The brokers had massively oversold the stock and could not physically settle the shares. Sai Rao was the gatekeeper who received this email and facilitated the administrative cover-up to protect the brokers. Remarkably, a forensic audit of Rao's professional background reveals that he has only one single professional recommendation on his public LinkedIn profile: a glowing endorsement from his longtime career mentor, Mark Kreitman. The exact same SEC director who silenced the Pequot Capital investigation to protect Epstein's financial network in 2005 had personally trained and groomed the SEC policy official who neutralized the MMTLP short squeeze in 2022. The pedigree of capture had come full circle, demonstrating a continuous, unbroken chain of custody designed to protect Wall Street's counterfeit share ledger at all costs. Chapter 15, The Captured Shield: Legal Oligarchs, Political Fixers, and Global Asset Plunder. Paul Weiss and the Chinese Gateway. For the global black market nexus to operate without fear of prosecution, the syndicate required an impenetrable legal shield. They secured this protection through a network of Tier 1 law firms that operated at the highest levels of international trade, corporate law, and sovereign defense. Foremost among these was Paul Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison. Paul Weiss served as a primary legal and operational hub for Jeffrey Epstein. Under the leadership of firm chairman Brad Karp, Paul Weiss lawyers actively structured Epstein's private trusts and managed his personal affairs. One Paul Weiss lawyer even helped Epstein navigate laws surrounding trafficking underage girls across state borders. Strategically, Paul Weiss was also the very first American law firm to establish an office in China, placing them at the exact geographic bottleneck where Western capital markets intersected with state-run Chinese conglomerates. The crossover between Paul Weiss and the Wall Street market-making apparatus is personified in Doug Sifu, the CEO of Virtu Financial. Sifu began his career as a corporate partner at Paul Weiss, representing General Atlantic, a massive private equity firm with deep ties to the Epstein-funded Robin Hood Foundation. At Paul Weiss, Sifu also acted as the personal attorney for prominent Epstein associates like Frederick Fekkai and drug-connected fashion mogul Carl Canny, establishing the precise legal templates that would later be used to shield Virtu's high-frequency algorithmic trading desks from regulatory disgorgement. The Libyan heist, Squire Patton Boggs, and the plunder of sovereign wealth. The syndicate's legal architecture was not designed merely to defend against domestic regulators. It was actively used to coordinate international asset-stripping campaigns. Following the 2011 NATO-backed overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, supported by Obama-era State Department officials, the country's vast sovereign wealth was left frozen in international bank accounts. To plunder these funds, the syndicate deployed the Tier 1 lobbying and law powerhouse Squire Patton Boggs. Patton Boggs formally registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, to represent the Libyan Transitional National Council, TNC, on a contingency basis. Behind the scenes, Epstein associate Greg Brown sent a detailed email to Jeffrey Epstein on July 15, 2011, outlining a plan to target $80 billion in frozen Libyan assets. Brown noted that Patton Boggs was pursuing the money and that they could extract a 10% to 25% compensation fee, translating to a multi-billion-dollar payday for identifying and recovering the state's wealth. At the same time, Patton Boggs worked to neutralize any domestic threats to the syndicate's financial machinery. The firm represented the Central Bank of Venezuela to shield state-backed capital flows, and later filed critical motions to quash subpoenas issued against Metamaterials, MMAT, the parent company of MMTLP, effectively shutting down public court discovery that would have exposed the offshore clearing routes of the counterfeit share ledger. The White House counsel, Catherine Rumler, and the Regulatory Shield. The ultimate link between political power and Wall Street protection was forged through Catherine Rumler. Rumler transitioned from serving as White House counsel to President Barack Obama to becoming a senior partner at Goldman Sachs and a member of the FINRA Board of Governors. According to unsealed files, Rumler was the single most emailed contact in Jeffrey Epstein's private network during his final years. Epstein actively monitored her career, coordinating with Apollo Global Management's Leon Black and other titans of high finance to position her for senior leadership roles. Rumler's career path placed her in a position of unmatched regulatory influence. Goldman Sachs. While serving as Goldman's top lawyer, she oversaw a balance sheet that carried over $274 billion in securities sold, but not yet purchased. A massive, unsettled short liability that Goldman routinely rolled over through offshore ex-clearing loopholes. FINRA. In December 2022, while Rumler sat on the FINRA Board of Governors, the regulator enacted the historic U3 halt on MMTLP. The halt occurred immediately after the Financial Information Forum, FIF, representing the major Wall Street brokerages, notified SEC regulators that their members had oversold the stock and could not physically settle the shares. Instead of forcing the brokers to buy back the counterfeit shares on the open market, FINRA froze the ticker, trapping retail investors and shielding the market-making syndicate from a catastrophic, multi-billion-dollar margin squeeze. MMTLP wasn't supposed to trade at all and would have had to have FINRA approval. This means someone other than the CEO of MMTLP asked for it to trade, and someone at FINRA approved it. That person likely was Cathy Rumler. Chapter 16, The Media Fixer, Charlie Gasparino and the Illusion of Oversight. The Gatekeeper's Number, Bear Stearns and the Unlisted Line. For the offshore short-selling syndicate to run its short and distort campaigns without public interference, it required a captured media mouthpiece to control market sentiment and shepherd retail investors into acting as exit liquidity. This role was allegedly filled by prominent Fox Business reporter Charlie Gasparino, whose entire career was built on the foundation of the very Wall Street firms that engineered the 2008 financial collapse. Gasparino openly admits that his deep ties to this network began at Bear Stearns, the precise firm where Jeffrey Epstein started his financial career, where Gasparino was close friends with several of Epstein's personal associates. The depth of Gasparino's integration into Epstein's personal network was laid bare in unsealed court documents. In 2019, immediately following Epstein's final arrest, Gasparino's assistant sent an email to Epstein and his defense team seeking a private, off-the-record interview. Crucially, the number Gasparino used to initiate this contact was not a publicly listed office line, but a highly restricted, secure private line reserved for Epstein's inner circle. The relationship was not merely professional, it was personal. Flight logs from Epstein's private jet, the Lolita Express, suggest that Gasparino flew on Epstein's plane on 2 separate occasions. The profile of the real estate friend of Epstein, who originally passed Epstein's unlisted number to Gasparino, points directly to billionaire developer John Catsimatidis, a prominent New York figure who bridged the gap between Manhattan real estate, Wall Street capital, and the media elite. The short and distort mouthpiece, Stephen Cohen and S3 Partners. Throughout the retail trading mania of 2021 and 2022, Gasparino deployed his media platform to aggressively attack retail stock communities, famously tweeting that shorting stocks like AMC, GME, and Bed Bath & Beyond was literally free money. Behind this public posturing, Gasparino was actively running cover for Epstein's closest financial allies, most notably Stephen Cohen of Point72/Melvin Capital and Glenn Dubin of Highbridge Capital, both of whom were heavily featured in Epstein's unsealed flight logs and promotional materials. Despite Cohen's firms being caught in massive naked shorting scandals, Gasparino publicly defended him on Fox Business, hailing him as one of the smartest investors out there. This media campaign was structurally backed by S3 Partners, a short interest and market sentiment analytics firm run by Gasparino's close personal friend, Bob Sloan. In a highly anomalous pattern, several senior executives from Equilend, the central securities lending consortium owned by a cartel of prime brokers including J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley, abruptly migrated to S3 Partners. This executive crossover allowed S3 Partners to serve as the exclusive gatekeeper of short-interest data, manipulating public reporting to conceal the true scale of naked shorting. To protect this system, Bob Sloan and Howard Mayerson of the Financial Information Forum, FIF, aggressively lobbied the SEC to delay and rewrite Rule 13 F2 and Form Show. By blocking these transparency rules, they ensured that the syndicate could continue to short more than 100% of an individual company's outstanding float, without ever triggering regulatory warnings or public disclosures. Rao's Pizza, the mob dug Sifu and front-running protection. The physical intersection where this financial manipulation, legal defense, and organized crime converged was Rao's Pizza in East Harlem, an exclusive restaurant historically designated as the headquarters where the mob met Wall Street. It was here that Gasparino was photographed alongside Doug Sifu, the CEO of Virtu Financial. Sifu's firm, Virtu, was engineered to act as a primary clearing desk, utilizing high-frequency smart routing algorithms to front-run retail client orders and generate billions in riskless principal trading. When the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance, led by Eric Girding, launched a major enforcement action against Virtu for systematically abusing client data, the regulatory shield was instantly activated. Girding, who simultaneously served on the advisory council for Columbia University alongside Sifu, allowed Virtu to settle the massive multi-billion-dollar front-running allegations for a trivial $2.5 million fine with no admission of guilt or disgorgement of profits. To protect this lucrative pipeline, Sifu deployed Paul Weiss lawyer Andrew Gordon to issue aggressive cease and desist letters to me for my independent research, mapping the physical coordinates of their network. The silence of the swamp, Kadzik, Podesta, and Pizzagate. Gasparino's complete silence on the deeper systemic corruption of the financial elite is tied directly to his personal relationships with key political fixers of the Washington establishment. Chief among these is Peter Kadzik, whom Gasparino has publicly cited as a close personal friend. Kadzik, the former Assistant Attorney General for Legislative Affairs at the DOJ, is the lifelong friend and legal counsel for Clinton campaign chairman John Podesta. Leaked emails reveal the true nature of this relationship, with Podesta writing that Kadzik was a fantastic lawyer who literally kept me out of jail. This political network is further bound together by Michael Kempner, a high-level Democratic Party fundraiser and public relations tycoon who worked hand-in-hand with Podesta during the 2016 election cycle. Kempner famously hired disgraced Congressman Anthony Weiner as a senior vice president at his firm, MWW Group, to manage corporate damage control. Because Gasparino routinely utilized Kempner and MWW Group as primary, anonymous sources for his breaking corporate and political crossover stories, he was structurally integrated into the very lobbyist pipelines that managed reputation recovery for the swamp. This multi-layered network of mutual liabilities, stretching from Kadzik and Podesta to Kempner and Weiner, explains why Gasparino, a self-styled conservative investigative journalist, has maintained absolute, permanent silence on the structural, child exploitation, and money laundering scandals, choosing instead to act as the primary media shield for the very oligarchs running the global black market. Chapter 17. The Ultimate Reckoning. Executive Orders, OFAC Sanctions, and the Forced Liquidation of the Shadow Market. The Sanctions Choke Point. The transition from traditional money laundering to the synthetic share ledger was born of necessity. The systematic stripping of wire data, the toll system, used for decades to move black market Iranian capital, became too visible for the digital age. The historic penalties against BNP Paribas and its peers proved that the front door of the SWIFT system was no longer a safe corridor for the global black market. This forced a strategic migration of capital into the unregulated gaps of the Wall Street clearing system, where counterfeit shares of targeted American businesses replaced the wire transfer as the primary, untraceable vehicle for moving illicit funds. This ghost ledger functioned as a parallel financial system, insulated by the very institutions designed to police it. By utilizing offshore multi-custody accounts and bona fide market maker exemptions, the syndicate could roll over massive short liabilities indefinitely, effectively parking billions in untaxed, unsettled proceeds in tax havens. However, the emergence of the retail meme stock movement in 2021 broke the mechanical silence of this arrangement, placing the global collateral framework of this laundering apparatus under unprecedented pressure. The reorganization trap. When the syndicate initiated its mafia bust-out procedures to suppress this retail threat, the goal was the absolute liquidation of companies like Bed Bath & Beyond, BBBY. But the script failed. Following the 2023 bankruptcy declaration, the proceedings transformed into a complex RICO-style reorganization. Instead of the shell being burned to the ground and the short positions zeroed out, the waterfall of asset distribution was systematically delayed, turning the bankruptcy estate into a holding zone for billions in unresolved short positions and total return swaps. The subsequent settlements for breach of fiduciary duty and the enactment of fraudulent conveyance rules meant that payments made years before the filing were suddenly subject to clawback. With Bye Bye Baby reorganized rather than liquidated, the path opened for old equity to potentially attach to the new company, provided the debt was cleared. This stalled the death spiral the syndicate required to keep their positions hidden, leaving the massive short interest exposed just as a new geopolitical hammer began to descend. The OFAC trapdoor, forced liquidation. The final reckoning for this shadow market will not come from captured regulators like the SEC, but through national security directives. Under decisive executive mandates, any international financial institution caught processing transactions for sanctioned regimes, the very institutions backing the syndicate's short positions, is now being severed from the U.S. dollar clearing system. This cutoff triggers the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, to intervene. As these institutions lose the ability to maintain their multi-custody rehypothecation pools, they are stripped of the locates that sustained their naked short positions. This is the trapdoor. When OFAC implements high-stakes sanctions, it issues general licenses with strict, time-limited windows for the structured wind-down of operations and the mandatory closeout of derivative positions. For banks laundering black market capital, this translates to a legal requirement to cover every phantom share printed. Under the threat of permanent exclusion from the global dollar network, these institutions will be forced to buy back the counterfeit ledger in the open market, violently liquidating the greatest financial heist in history. Chapter 18, The Sovereign Reset, Stablecoin Treasuries and the Death of the Central Bank Cartel. Reclaiming the Wealth, the U.S. Sovereign Wealth Fund. For decades, the globalist central banking cartel operated on a simple formula: privatize the profits and socialize the risks. Illicit capital generated from black market operations and offshore naked short selling was routinely parked in tax havens like the Cayman Islands or channeled through foreign sovereign wealth entities. A prime example of this was Temasek, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore. Temasek held a minority ownership in Virtu Financial, invested heavily in the failed FTX cryptocurrency exchange, and maintained significant stakes in both the Bank of China and BlackRock. This offshore network acted as a highly insulated vacuum, siphoning wealth away from productive economies and into the hands of a protected financial class. The turning point occurs when the massive, unsettled liabilities of the short-selling syndicate are forcefully liquidated via national security mandates and OFAC closeout windows. Instead of allowing this recovered capital to be absorbed back into the commercial banking system or intercepted by captured regulatory bodies, the national policy shifts toward a nationalist economic strategy. The trillions of dollars clawed back from the predatory offshore banking sector are captured and redirected to establish a premier U.S. sovereign wealth fund. Rather than acting as pirates who only destroy value through shorting and corporate bust-outs, this new fund positions the nation as a builder, utilizing the seized capital of the black market to rebuild domestic infrastructure and secure long-term energy and manufacturing independence. The stablecoin standard, creating the infinite bond sink. To execute a wealth transfer of this scale without collapsing the plumbing of the global financial system, the settlement of outstanding short positions in GameStop, GME, MMTLP, BBBYQ, and AMC must transition to new, transparent blockchain rails. Under this new framework, the multi-trillion-dollar short liabilities are forced to settle on-chain using USD-denominated stablecoins. For these stablecoins to remain valid, stable, and legally compliant under strict U.S. regulatory oversight, the issuing entities must back them one-to-one with high-quality collateral, primarily U.S. Treasury bonds. This regulatory requirement triggers a massive, systemic economic feedback loop. 1. Unprecedented demand. To settle the synthetic, naked short positions that have been rolled over for years, prime brokers and market makers must purchase trillions of dollars worth of stablecoins. 2. Treasury buying spree. The stablecoin issuers, in turn, are legally mandated to use those incoming fiat funds to buy up physical U.S. treasuries in matching volume. 3. Yield compression. This sudden, massive, and continuous influx of buying pressure on U.S. government debt drives bond yields and market interest rates to historic lows, refinancing the national debt and bypassing the Fed. By generating an artificial, non-inflationary demand sink for government debt through stablecoin backing, the U.S. Treasury achieves ultimate fiscal flexibility. The Treasury can successfully refinance the nation's outstanding national debt at near-zero interest rates, dramatically lowering the annual debt service burden on the American public. Most importantly, this entire settlement and refinancing pipeline completely bypasses the Federal Reserve and its network of primary dealer banks. For generations, the Federal Reserve maintained a monopoly over the monetary system, utilizing the interest on reserve balances, IORB, mechanism to pay commercial banks high interest rates to keep their cash parked at the Fed rather than circulating in the real economy. This artificially restricted liquidity and forced the public to rely on high-interest private credit. By routing the settlement of the global short debt directly through Treasury-backed stablecoins, the IORB mechanism is rendered obsolete. The parallel financial system, built on transparent, ledger-based assets rather than the debt-based, X-clearing loopholes of the central banking system, is fully activated. The era of central bank manipulation comes to an end, transitioning the nation into a new golden age of sovereignty, transparent capital markets, and public prosperity. Chapter 19, The Golden Age, Sovereign Reindustrialization and the New Incentive-Based Geopolitics. Shifting from financial engineering to real value creation. For nearly half a century, the global financial system operated as a giant vacuum, siphoning capital away from productive, real-world enterprises and routing it into complex, speculative instruments. Trillions of dollars were trapped in the offshore, ghost ledgers of naked short positions, synthetic locate loops, and dark pool derivatives. This hyper-financialization did not build factories, improve infrastructure, or raise the standard of living. It existed solely to enrich a predatory financial class while systematically hollowing out the middle class through corporate, mafia bustouts. The liquidation of these massive, unreported short liabilities via national security mandates and OFAC closeout windows marks the end of this speculative era. Instead of allowing this captured capital to be recycled back into the compromised commercial banking system, the wealth transfer is captured and redirected to establish a premier U.S. sovereign wealth fund. For the first time in modern history, capital is deployed under a strictly nationalist economic strategy. The fund's mandate is to invest exclusively in domestic sectors that generate tangible, long-term value. Artificial intelligence, developing sovereign, secure AI infrastructure that leads the world in innovation. Automated manufacturing, building next-generation, fully automated factories that operate at high efficiency, reducing labor costs and eliminating the need to outsource production to hostile foreign nations. By shifting capital away from the unproductive, financial alchemy of Wall Street and directing it toward advanced technology, the nation lays the foundation for a permanent economic surplus. Breaking the globalist trade trap, the nationalist security shield. The corporate and political architects of globalism actively designed a world order that forced nations into a state of hyperdependence on global trade. The catastrophic vulnerability of this design was laid bare during the 2020 COVID-19 lockdowns, when global supply chains suddenly fractured, leaving the West unable to secure basic manufactured goods, medical supplies, and critical technology. The globalist model had intentionally traded national self-sufficiency for cheap foreign labor, leaving domestic markets completely exposed to foreign manufacturing monopolies. By leveraging the massive capital influx from the sovereign wealth transfer into automated domestic manufacturing, the United States structurally breaks this dependency. Advanced automation eliminates the competitive advantage of cheap offshore labor, allowing the U.S. to produce high-tech goods, consumer products, and industrial hardware entirely within its own borders. To insulate this newly rebuilt domestic economy from being undermined by state-subsidized foreign competitors, particularly China, a robust tariff wall is established. These tariffs serve a dual purpose. 1. The shield. They protect domestic capital investments in automated factories and AI, ensuring that American-made goods are always competitive in the home market. 2. The Treasury sink. They generate a secondary, non-inflationary stream of federal revenue that further strengthens the sovereign wealth fund, completely bypassing the debt generation loops of the Federal Reserve. It also can become a substitute for income tax, which incentivizes people to work hard because they will keep more of the money they make. Transparent deals over secret coups, the new geopolitical doctrine. For decades, global foreign relations were dictated by the covert operations of the Safari Club, a shadow alliance of intelligence agencies that utilized illegal weapons trafficking, black market drug corridors, and artificial regional conflicts to destabilize sovereign nations and force critical natural resources onto the black market. Under this old paradigm, if a foreign government refused to align with the central banking cartel, the solution was a coordinated coup to install a compliant puppet regime. The new geopolitical framework replaces this covert, coup-based model with transparent, business-driven incentives. Under this doctrine, international relations are managed through transparent, bilateral business contracts. The tariff wall is not a permanent barrier designed to enforce isolation, but rather a flexible negotiation tool. If a foreign nation offers the United States a mutually beneficial, fair trade deal, the tariffs are lowered or removed entirely. This shift fundamentally realigns the geopolitical landscape, particularly for energy-producing nations like the Gulf countries. Under the old system, these nations were perpetually threatened by the state-sponsored terrorism of the Iranian IRGC, which was funded by black market oil sales and protected by corrupt Western political networks to keep Middle Eastern oil heavily financialized. This constant security threat forced the Gulf nations to move closer to China's sphere of control for strategic protection. With the dismantling of the IRGC's black market cash cow and the neutralization of the Iranian missile threat, the geopolitical leverage shifts. The Gulf nations no longer need to live in fear of their own security. They are freed to bring their energy resources to the light in transparent, stable partnerships with a self-sufficient, technologically superior United States. The era of dark, backroom deals and intelligence-sponsored coups comes to an end, giving rise to a global golden age rooted in sovereignty, national self-reliance, and transparent, contract-based peace.